Hello everyone, and welcome back to Little Nightmare. I'm Michael, and before we begin, I'd like to ask for a little support. Please subscribe, leave a like, and if you do, let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from. These may seem like small gestures, but they're essential for helping the channel grow and allowing me to keep bringing you these stories every night. Now, lower the volume just a bit, get comfortable, turn off the lights, and let's dive together into tonight's first story. The sound was a small, dry ticking, like the legs of a beetle trapped behind the wallpaper. It was the only thing in the house that was not silent. Kristen focused on it, letting the rhythm fill the hollows of her skull, a tiny metronome counting out the seconds of the long, gray afternoon. It was a safe sound, a known sound. It was the clock on the mantelpiece, the one with the porcelain shepherdess, her face chipped and smiling blindly. It was a sound from the world before. In the perpetual twilight of the boarded-up living room, her children were still. Liam, 7, sat on the floor, his small fingers tracing the patterns in the worn Persian rug. His sister, Maya, who was 5, leaned against him, her thumb in her mouth. They both wore the soft, black silk blindfolds that were as much a part of them now as their own skin. They had been born into this sightless world, but Kristen remembered. She remembered the color of the sky, the shape of her husband's smile, the devastating green of a summer leaf. The memory was a sickness, a beautiful, terminal cancer. She never let them go without the blindfolds. Not to sleep, not to eat, not for a single unguarded moment. The stories were not stories. They were history. They were the gospel of survival. A man peeks through a crack in his barricade to check if the rain has stopped. He sees the thing perched on the telephone wire, a shape that should not be, a geometry that unravels the mind. He is found an hour later, his own hands having done the work his shattered consciousness could no longer bear. A woman, desperate for a glimpse of the sun, pulls back a corner of the blackout cloth. She sees the movement in the street below, a slow, fluid shifting that has nothing to do with the way things are supposed to move. She spends the next 3 days screaming about the colors in her head before she simply stops. Stops moving, stops breathing. The creatures were not seen, they were perceived. And perception was a death sentence. The mind, upon receiving the image, would instantly and violently reject its own reality. It would break. It would shatter like glass. The ticking clock was a comfort. It was a landmark in a featureless plane of time. But tonight, another sound joined it. A faint, rhythmic scratching at the front door. Not the wind. The wind was a low moan. This was deliberate. A fingernail on wood. Kristen went perfectly still. Her breath caught in her throat. A sharp, cold stone. Liam lifted his head, his blindfolded face turning toward the sound. Maya whimpered and pressed closer to him. The scratching stopped. Silence rushed back in, thicker and heavier than before. Then a voice, low and rasping, filtered through the heavy door. Kristen, it's David, from number 12. She didn't move. David died. She remembered him. A big man, a plumber, with a loud, easy laugh. That was years ago. They're coming. The voice whispered, the words slurred with a terror so profound it seemed to dissolve the edges of language itself. The lines are failing. The town is lost. You have to go. We're going to the coast. There's a place, a lighthouse. They say the light. It does something. It holds them back. A lighthouse. A foolish, desperate fairy tale. But the only one left. I saw one, Kristen, David sobbed, the sound wet and broken. Just a piece of it. Out of the corner of my eye, my wife, she's gone. My boy, he won't stop crying. Please, The scratching started again, more frantic now. Then it was replaced by a soft, wet thudding, a head knocking against the door, over and over. Kristen stood up, her joints aching. She moved to the door, not to open it, but to press her ear against the cold wood. She could hear his ragged breathing, the hitching of his chest. "David," she said, her voice barely a breath. The thudding stopped. "You're there. Go away, David. They're in the wall," he whispered. "You can hear them. Breathing. It's not a sound. It's a feeling in your teeth. Noon, the other day." She closed her eyes, a useless gesture behind the blindfold. She saw him in her mind, his big frame slumped against her door, his own blindfold probably askew, his mind already coming apart at the seams from what he had glimpsed. "The lighthouse," he pleaded. "We have to try." A sudden sharp crack from down the street, a window giving way. A scream, high and thin, was cut off with the wet finality of a zipper closing. David gasped. "They're here. God, they're here." She heard him scramble to his feet, heard his footsteps, clumsy and panicked, recede down the porch steps and into the street. Then a new sound. A sound that was not a sound, but a silence that was somehow loud. A vacuum that swallowed the very air. It was followed by a single, choked gurgle from David, and then nothing. The old world was gone. The ticking clock was a lie. There was only this house, and the things outside, and the journey to a myth. She woke the children with soft touches and hushed words. There was no time for fear, only for motion. She filled a backpack with water pouches, with protein bars that tasted of dust and chalk, with extra blindfolds of thick layered velvet. She took a knife, long and sharp. It was not for the creatures. It was a mercy for them, for her, if it came to that. They slipped out the back door, into the alley that ran behind the houses. The air was different outside. It was cold and carried smells of damp earth and rust and something else, something sweetly rotten, like overripe fruit left in the sun. The world was a symphony of terror played solely through sound and touch. The crunch of their shoes on gravel was a deafening announcement. The whisper of the wind through dead trees was a chorus of hidden watchers. They moved in a chain, Kristen leading, Liam holding her belt, Maya holding his. They were three blind mice, scurrying through a landscape of giants. They walked for hours, or maybe days. Time had lost its meaning. It was measured in heartbeats, in the burn of muscles, in the deepening thirst. They encountered others, a group of 4, led by a woman named Anya, whose voice was as hard and cold as flint. They merged for a time, a fragile caravan of the blind. There was a comfort in numbers, a shared warmth in the perpetual chill, but the world was hostile. It was not just the creatures, it was the collapse. A car, its doors hanging open, blocked their path, a metal skeleton picked clean. They had to navigate around it by touch, their hands sliding over cold, gritty glass and slick, rain-slicked metal. Once, Liam's foot plunged through a rotten board on a bridge, and his scream was a shard of glass in the silent air. Kristen hauled him out, his leg wet and cold, her heart a frantic bird beating against her ribs. The worst was the town they had to cross, Elmhaven, Dartorour. The name was a cruel joke. The air here was thick with the iron and copper smell of old blood. The sounds were wrong. Their footsteps echoed too much, as if the buildings were hollow. And there were the whispers. Not human whispers. These were the sounds of things moving through narrow spaces, of dry scales sliding over brick, of a low, resonant humming that seemed to vibrate in the marrow of their bones. "Don't listen," Anya commanded, her voice a tight wire. "It's not for your ears, it's for your mind. It finds the cracks." They hurried, a tangle of desperate blind figures, their hands clutching at each other, The humming grew louder. It was not a single tone, but a chord, a dissonant, awful harmony that made Kristen's teeth ache and her vision swim with colors that weren't there behind her blindfold. Then Maya screamed, a high, pure sound of utter terror. Kristen whirled, pulling the child into her arms. What? What is it? I felt it. Maya sobbed, her small body trembling violently. On my neck. It was cold and smooth, like stone, but it moved. Nice. Panic erupted through their small group. Someone bumped into Kristen hard. She stumbled, losing her grip on Liam's hand. Liam, Mom. His voice was close, but the echoing streets distorted it. The humming was everywhere now, pressing in, a physical weight. She heard Anya shouting, a curse. Then the sound of running footsteps, scattering, dissolving into the maze of streets. Liam, stay where you are, don't move. She crawled forward, one hand clutching Maya, the other sweeping the ground in front of her. Her fingers brushed against rough asphalt, a wad of something soft and wet. Then, blessedly, the familiar fabric of Liam's jacket. She grabbed him, pulling both children to her. A trembling island in a sea of auditory horror. They were alone. The others were gone, swallowed by the town. They did not stop moving. Fear was afire in their blood. They fled Elmhaven, stumbling out onto a road flanked by silent, skeletal trees. The awful humming faded, replaced by the normal, terrifying silence. They walked until their legs gave out, collapsing in the dry ditch beside the road. Kristen held her children as they shivered in the cold. She could feel the fragility of their bodies, the frantic flutter of their hearts. She had nothing left to give them but the warmth of her own failing body and the hollow promise of a lighthouse. Days bled into one another. The landscape changed. The air grew saltier, sharper. They could hear the distant, rhythmic crash of waves. Hope, a dangerous and forgotten emotion, began to prick at the edges of Kristen's exhaustion. They found the path, just as David had said. A narrow, rocky trail that wound up a steep, windswept cliff. The sound of the ocean was a roar here, a powerful, cleansing noise that drowned out the whispers in their own minds. The climb was agony. Their muscles screamed. Their lungs burned. But they climbed, and then they were there. The ground leveled out. The wind was a constant buffeting force, and ahead, a solid, immovable presence, was the lighthouse. They could feel its mass, the sheer ancient strength of it. They could hear a new sound, a slow, grinding creak, and then a brilliant, searing whiteness. Even through the thick, layered silk of their blindfolds, they saw it. The light. It was not just bright. It was a physical pressure against their closed eyelids, a pure white heat that promised safety, that promised an end to the fear. A voice, rough but sane, called out from nearby. You made it. Come inside, quickly. It was a man's voice, weary but strong. The door to the lighthouse groaned open. Kristen, clutching her children, stumbled toward the sound, toward the warmth she could already feel emanating from within. They were safe. They had reached the sanctuary. They crossed the threshold. The door slammed shut behind them, the sound echoing in a vast, circular space. The air was still and warm, smelling of oil and old stone and baked bread. Real bread. You can take them off now, the man said. His voice was closer now, just in front of them. You're safe here. The light, it keeps this place clean, you can see. Kristen's hands trembled. She had not seen her children's faces in 5 years. She had not seen anything but the inside of her own blindfold. The temptation was an agony. To see Liam's face, to see if he still had his father's eyes, to see Maya smile. Slowly, hesitantly, Her fingers numb with a fear greater than any she had known on the road, she reached up. She touched the knot at the back of her head. She could hear the children doing the same, their small, eager hands fumbling with the silk. The man was breathing softly, waiting. Just as the first fold of silk began to loosen over her eyes, as a sliver of that glorious, blinding light touched her skin, she heard it. A small, wet, clicking sound. Not from outside. From inside the room. From the man. It was the sound of a mouth, of a throat, shaped all wrong. Her hands froze. The children's hands froze. The man spoke again, his voice still weary, still sane. But underneath it now, she heard the lie. She heard the terrible patient hunger. "Go on," the thing in the lighthouse whispered. "Let me see you." Her blood turned to ice in her veins. Every instinct, every lesson of the long darkness screamed at her. The children were still, their small hands poised at the knots of their blindfolds, sensing her terror like animals sensing a storm. The thing that had spoken let out a soft, sighing breath. It was a perfect imitation of human relief. But now she could hear the subtle wrongness, the faint, wet rattle at the end of the exhalation. Think. You have to think. Her voice, when she found it, was a strained, thin wire. The light, it's so bright. Our eyes, they've been in the dark for so long. It will take a moment. We don't want to be blinded. A silence. Then the sound of a foot shifting on the stone floor. It was a sticky sound, as if the sole did not quite lift away cleanly. "Of course," the voice said. Its patience a thin veneer over an infinite, crawling hunger. A wise precaution. "There is a bench to your left. You may sit." Kristen moved slowly, her hands finding Liam and Maya, pulling them close. She guided them, her own blindfold securely in place, toward where the bench must be. Her shins bumped against rough-hewn wood. They sat, huddled together. The warmth she had felt from the lighthouse was not the warmth of a hearth. It was the damp, biological heat of a living thing, a vast, breathing organism. She could hear it now, beneath the groan of the machinery and the distant crash of waves. A low, pulsing hum that resonated in the stone beneath them. It was the same dissonant chord from Elmhaven, but here it was the foundation, the bedrock of this place. The lighthouse was not a sanctuary. It was a heart, a beating, monstrous heart. "We heard stories," Kristen said, her voice barely above a whisper. She needed to keep it talking, to find a flaw in the performance. "We heard the light held them back." "The light is a lure," the thing said, and there was a hint of a smile in its voice now. A ghastly indulgence. "It calls to the lost. It promises what they most desire. Safety. Community. A return to the world before. They come like moths, and they stay." She heard a slow, dragging step closer. The sweet, rotten smell was stronger here, concentrated. It was the smell of the thing itself. "Your fear is so sharp," it whispered, its voice dropping into a confiding, intimate tone. "It has been so long since we had fresh visitors, the others, the ones who have been here. Their fear has grown stale. It has lost its flavor." A cold, smooth object brushed against her cheek. She flinched violently, stifling a scream. It felt like a finger made of polished bone or chitin. It trailed down her face, toward the edge of her blindfold. "Let me see you," it repeated, its whisper now full of that wet, clicking sound. "I want to watch the understanding in your eyes. I want to see the moment the hope dies." This was it. There was no running. The door was shut. They were in its belly. Her hand tightened on the knife in her pocket. It was not for the creature. It was the mercy. For Liam. For Maya. Her beautiful, blind children who had never seen a tree or a cloud. or their mother's face. Just as her fingers closed around the hilt, a new sound cut through the oppressive hum. A frantic, desperate pounding on the heavy lighthouse door. A voice, raw and familiar, shouted from outside. "Kristen, are you in there? For God's sake, don't look. Don't believe it." It was Anya. The thing in the room let out a hiss of pure, undiluted fury. The kindly, weary persona shattered completely, replaced by a sound of tearing fabric and snapping tendons. The air moved as it spun away from them, its attention ripped toward the door. This was their only chance. Kristen leaped to her feet, pulling the children up. "The stairs," she hissed into their ears. "Find the stairs." They stumbled forward, hands flailing, hitting a curving stone wall. Kristen's free hand scrambled along it, finding the open, spiraling void of a staircase. It was narrow and steep, coiling up into the heart of the light. The thing was at the door now. She heard the heavy bolt screech as it was thrown, heard the door groan open, heard Anya's defiant scream, which was cut short by a sound like a sack of wet grain being dropped. "Up!" Kristen screamed, shoving Liam ahead of her. "Don't stop. Don't look back." They climbed. The grinding of the great lens above them was deafening, the light so intense it was a physical heat through their blindfolds, a white-hot brand on their faces. The air thrummed with the power of it. Below, she heard a scrabbling, a multi-limbed scrambling, as the thing began its pursuit. They burst out onto a metal grating, the lamp room. The world was a roar of wind and light. Kristen slammed the heavy trapdoor shut, her fingers fumbling for a latch, a lock. There was only a simple iron bolt. She drove it home. Immediately, something heavy slammed against the trapdoor from below. The metal buckled. The bolt groaned, its screws straining in the old wood. It was coming. Kristen turned, pulling the children to the far side of the circular room, putting the great, rotating lens between them and the trapdoor. The light swept past them, a wave of annihilating whiteness, and then she saw it. Through a gap in the boards covering the windows, a sliver of the outside world was visible. Not the world she remembered. The sky was a bruised, swirling purple. The sea was black, and things moved in it. Vast, slow shapes that defied proportion. And on the cliffs below, she saw them. The creatures, not with her eyes, but with her mind, perceiving them in the way the light illuminated their impossible forms for a fleeting second. They were a crawling, shifting forest of angles and eyes, drawn to the beacon, waiting. The lighthouse was not a refuge. It was a feeder. It drew in the lost, and it drew in the things that hunted them. The trapdoor splintered. A long, pale, jointed limb, ending in a cluster of hooked barbs, slithered through the opening, feeling its way across the metal grating. Kristen pulled the knife from her pocket. She looked at her children, their blindfolded faces turned toward her, trusting her to the end. The mercy. It was the only thing left. But as the thing pulled its bulk through the shattered doorway, unfolding into the lamp room, a different instinct took hold. A raw, maternal fury that rejected the quiet, passive act of the mercy stroke. It would not have them. This thing, this place, would not have their fear. She turned to face the light, the great, blazing heart of the lie. "Take my hands!" she yelled over the roar. Liam and Maya clutched her, their small hands gripping hers with a desperate strength. The light swept around again. This time, she did not flinch from it. She stepped forward, dragging her children with her, directly into the path of the brilliant rotating beam. She looked directly into the light, and she screamed, not in terror, but in defiance. A raw sound ripped from the core of her being, a final, furious rejection of the darkness. The world dissolved into a searing, silent white. The white was not an absence, but a presence. It was a solid, burning thing that filled her skull, scouring away thought, memory, fear. For a moment, there was only the light, a purity of agony that was almost peace. Then the light passed, and the world crashed back in. But it was a different world. The colors were gone. The purple sky, the black sea, the monstrous shapes. All were rendered in stark, blinding monochrome, outlines etched in searing white against a void of black. She could see, but the sight was a weapon, a sensory assault that made her stagger. The creature behind her let out a shriek that was not a sound but a tear in the fabric of the air. She turned, her new painful vision registering it not as a shape, but as a negative space, a crawling void of absolute blackness that hurt to look at. It recoiled from the after-image of the light, its many limbs scrabbling against the metal grating. The children were screaming, but their screams were distant, muffled by the ringing in her ears. She saw their small forms, shimmering with a soft, silver luminescence, their blindfolds still on. The light had not harmed them. It had only touched her. Her knife was still in her hand. The mercy was forgotten. Now it was a tool of war. As the creature gathered itself, its void-like form pulsating with hate, Kristen did not retreat. She charged. She did not aim for a heart or a head. She had no idea if such things exist. She aimed for the center of the blackness, plunging the long blade into the nothingness. There was a sensation not of piercing flesh, but of rupturing a sack of freezing, stagnant water. A geyser of black fluid, visible only as a deeper black in her stark vision, erupted from the wound. The shriek came again, a physical force that slammed into her, and a barbed limb lashed out, catching her across the shoulder. The pain was immediate and electric, a cold fire that spread down her arm. She fell back, the knife torn from her grasp, skittering across the grating. The creature thrashed, its form beginning to lose cohesion, the edges of its void body blurring and smoking as if burned by the very air. The great light swept around again. This time, as it touched the wounded creature, the blackness of its form ignited into a silent white flame. It contorted, its shriek cut off, and then it simply unraveled, dissolving into motes of ash that were swallowed by the wind. Silence, save for the grind of the lens and the roar of the sea. Kristen clutched her bleeding shoulder, gasping. The monochrome world swam around her. She crawled to her children, pulling them into her arms. They were sobbing, trembling. "We have to go down," she whispered, her voice raw. "We have to get out of this place." They stumbled back to the shattered trapdoor. The climb down was a nightmare. Her vision flickered, the stark white and black shifting, sometimes failing altogether, leaving her in a blur of gray. The warm, breathing darkness of the lighthouse interior felt even more malevolent now. She could hear other things now, soft, slithering movements in the walls, drawn by the death of their kin. They reached the bottom. The main door stood open, swinging in the wind. Of Anya, there was no sign, only a dark, wet stain on the stones. They ran, blind again, for she dared not use her new treacherous sight. They fled the lighthouse, down the cliff path, away from the siren call of the false sanctuary. They ran till the salt spray was just a memory on the air, and the terrible light was a faint glow on the horizon behind them. They collapsed in a thicket of pine, the needles a prickly bed. The old familiar darkness was a relief. As she held her children, trying to soothe them to sleep, Kristen finally understood. David's myth was a trap. There was no safe place. There was only the road, and the darkness, and the will to keep moving. The lighthouse was a lesson, written in light and blood. The journey was not to a place. It was away from all the places that promised an end. It was simply to survive. The pine needles were a poor blanket, but they were a barrier between her family and the cold, hungry earth. The children finally slept, their breathing evening out into shallow, exhausted rhythms. Kristen did not sleep. The wound on her shoulder throbbed with a deep, icy ache that the night air seemed to amplify. When she touched it, her fingers came away sticky, not with blood, but with a dark, viscous fluid that smelled of ozone and spoiled meat. The thing's claw had poisoned her. She could feel it, a slow, creeping chill spreading from the gash, threading through her veins. It was a familiar coldness, the same she had felt in the presence of the creatures. Only now it was inside her, becoming a part of her. Dawn came, a gradual graying of the world behind her blindfold. She did not remove it. Her new sight was a curse, a glimpse into a reality that would shatter her mind if she used it for long. It was a weapon, she realized, one that burned the wielder as much as the target. They drank from a muddy stream, chewing on the last of their dried roots. The children were quiet, their spirits crushed by the lighthouse, their hope extinguished. They moved with a mechanical weariness that broke Kristen's heart. For days they traveled, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the coast. The land grew flatter, the trees sparser. The chill in Kristen's shoulder worsened, a constant grinding pain that made her lightheaded. She began to hear things, not with her ears, but in the core of her being, a faint, dissonant hum. The same one that had permeated Elmhaven and the lighthouse. It was inside her now, a radio tuned to a station of static and whispers. One afternoon, as they skirted the edge of a vast, silent bog, Liam stopped. He pointed a trembling finger ahead. "Mama, a person." Kristen's heart seized. She peered from beneath her blindfold. 100 yards away, a figure stood motionless, silhouetted against the gray sky. It looked human. It wore a tattered coat. Its head was bowed. "Stay here," she whispered, pushing the children behind a skeletal birch tree. She approached slowly, her hand on the hilt of her new knife, a sharpened piece of flint she had found. The figure did not move. As she drew closer, she saw the details. The coat was not just tattered. It was fused to the skin in places. The fabric and flesh grown together in a slick, leathery hide. The head was not bowed in sorrow, but because the neck had elongated, the spine curving in an impossible arc. The hands, resting at its sides, were too long, the fingers ending not in nails, but in sharp, bony points. It was one of the Taken, not a creature from the outside, but a person who had been changed, consumed from within by the same dissonance that now hummed in her own blood. She held her breath, ready to run, but the thing did not stir. It was simply waiting. And then, with a sudden, jerky motion, its head snapped up. There were no eyes, only smooth, sealed lids, but it was looking at her. It saw her not with light, but with the same frequency that now vibrated within her. Its mouth, a lipless slit, opened. A voice emerged, but it was not a single voice. It was a chorus of whispers, layered over one another, some pleading, some screaming, some chanting in a language that hurt her mind. "It knows you," the voices whispered in unison. "The light touched, the wounded. You are of the hum. You are almost home." The thing took a step toward her, its movement a series of unnatural twitches. It was not attacking. It was inviting. Kristen stumbled back, terror giving her strength. She turned and ran, grabbing the children and fleeing the bog, the whispered chorus following them on the wind. She ran until the poison in her shoulder flared into a white-hot agony, and the world went black. She awoke to the feeling of small hands on her face. Maya was wiping her brow with a damp cloth. Liam had built a small, smokeless fire in a hollow. They were in a shallow cave, the entrance partially blocked by stones. "You were talking," Liam said, his voice small and scared. "You were saying words we didn't know." Kristen tried to sit up, and a wave of nausea and cold, so profound it felt like burning, washed over her. The hum was louder now, a constant vibration in her teeth. She looked at her children, and for a terrifying second, she did not see their faces. She saw their outlines shimmering with a soft, silver light, just as they had in the lighthouse. But around them, she saw a faint, ugly corona of the same dissonant energy that pulsed from the taken. It was the energy of the world. It was on them. It was in them. They were all infected. The blindfolds, the rituals, they were not a perfect shield. They only slowed the inevitable. The world was not just haunted. It was transforming them, and the lighthouse was merely a catalyst, a focal point for a process that was happening everywhere, to everyone. She looked at her own hands. In the dim light of the cave, she could see it too, a faint, sickly shimmer around her fingers. The wound on her shoulder was no longer just a cut. It was a nexus, a point where the transformation was accelerating. The man in the lighthouse had not been lying when he said their fear had grown stale. He was not feeding on their fear of monsters. He was feeding on their struggle against the change. The ultimate fear was not of being eaten, but of becoming. She looked at her children, truly looked at them, not as a mother, but as a fellow survivor on a dying world. The mercy stroke was no longer an option. It was a surrender. The only choice left was what they would become. She reached out and took their hands. Their small, warm, still human hands. "We can't run from it anymore," she said, her voice raspy, the new chill giving it a strange, resonant quality. "The hum, it's inside us. It's in everything." Liam's lower lip trembled. "Are we going to become monsters?" Kristen looked toward the cave entrance, at the deepening twilight. The hum was a song now, a terrible, beautiful, and infinitely sad song. She could feel it pulling at her, promising an end to the pain, an end to the struggle. "A homecoming." "No," she whispered, pulling them closer. "We're going to learn to sing along." The cave was too small, the air too still. The hum was no longer an external threat, but an internal rhythm, a second heartbeat that synced with the slow, cold pulse of the poison in her shoulder. She could feel it mapping her nerves, rewriting her from the inside. The children were quiet, sensing the shift in her, the grim acceptance that had settled where terror once lived. "We can't stay here," she said, her voice a low thrum that matched the dissonance in the air. "It's drawn to stillness, to hiding. Where do we go?" Liam asked. His voice was thin, stretched tight with a fear he could no longer name. Kristen closed her eyes, listening. The hum was not a single note. It was a symphony of ruin, and within it she could now discern directions, pressures. Some sources pulled with the greedy, frantic hunger of the lighthouse. Others pushed with a cold, static emptiness. But one thread of the song felt different. It was slower, deeper, a bass note of immense patient age. It did not pull or push. It simply was, and it felt quiet. "There," she said, pointing not with her hand, but with her mind toward a place where the song felt oldest. "We follow the old part of the song." Layla left the cave as true night fell. Kristen did not blindfold herself. She let her new sight, the painful white-on-black vision, wash over the landscape. It was like reading a map of death. The trees were silver-gray skeletons, their life force a faint, fading glow at their cores. Small animals were quick, bright sparks that flitted and vanished. But other things moved in the darkness, things that were voids, like the creature in the lighthouse, or shimmering, chaotic auras like the taken by the bog. She led them not by sight alone, but by feeling the pressure of the voids and steering away, toward the deep, thrumming quiet. It was exhausting. Each use of the sight felt like a layer of her own self was being sanded away, leaving behind something raw and resonant. The children clung to her coat, their own small auras flickering with fatigue and a dawning, terrible understanding. They walked for hours, until the ground began to slope downward into a deep, wooded ravine. The air grew heavy and still. The chaotic hum of the world above faded, muffled by the dense canopy of ancient, towering pines. Here, the song was different. It was the sound of roots digging deep, of stones sleeping, of time passing in millennia, not moments. In the center of the ravine, nestled against a sheer rock face, was a cabin. It was not a welcoming sight. It was slumped and weathered, its roof sagging, its windows dark and empty. But to Kristen's sight, it was the first thing she had seen that did not hurt to look at. It had no aura, no void, no shimmer. It was simply neutral, a hole in the screaming fabric of the world. Cautiously, they approached. The door was unlocked. The interior was one room, dusty and spare, filled with the scent of dry rot and old peace. On the rough-hewn table sat a single unlit oil lamp, and next to it, a book. Kristen lit the lamp with trembling hands. The warm, yellow light was a shock to her system, a gentle memory of a world before the white, burning glare. She opened the book. The pages were handwritten, the ink faded. It was not a story of monsters or myths. It was a journal. The first entry was dated decades earlier. They called it the change, the hum, the song of unmaking. They are not wrong, but they are not entirely right. It is not an invasion. It is a tuning. The universe is shifting to a new frequency, and our reality is an off-key note it is trying to correct. The creatures are its antibodies. The taken are those who are assimilating. Kristen's breath caught. She read on, her eyes racing over the spidery script. The lighthouses, the safe havens, are resonators. They amplify the new frequency, speeding up the change in those who seek refuge. They are traps for the hopeful. The only places of reprieve are the null zones, places where the bedrock is so old and dense it dampens the song. This cabin is built on one. It will not last forever. The song is patient. It will find a way, and I have learned to listen. I have learned to build walls not of wood or stone, but of silence. It is the only defense. But the silence changes you too. It makes you still. It makes you less. The final entry was a single line. The quiet is eating me. I must go out and hear the song again, even if it unmakes me. Kristen looked up from the book, her heart a frantic drum against the icy stillness in her chest. This was not a sanctuary. It was a prison of a different kind. A slow, quiet death. Outside, the deep, old quiet of the ravine pressed in, a smothering blanket. She could feel it seeping into her, calming the hum, soothing the pain in her shoulder. It was a relief, and that was the most terrifying thing of all. She looked at her children, their faces soft in the lamplight, already looking more peaceful than they had in weeks. She could stay here. They could be still. They could be quiet. They could be less together until the quiet ate them too. Or they could go back out. They could learn the song. They could learn to sing, not with the desperate fear of the taken, but with a purpose. To navigate, to survive, to find others who were not just running, but listening. The choice was no longer between life and death. It was between silence and a voice. She closed the book. The children were watching her, waiting. She took a deep breath and made her choice. Story 2. It began not with a sound or a sight, but with a chill. A single, concentrated point of cold, no larger than a silver dollar, that bloomed in the exact center of my chest as I sat reading in my study. It was a deep cold, the kind that feels less like an absence of heat and more like an active presence, a siphon drawing all warmth from the very marrow of my bones. I remember setting down my book, a heavy tome on cellular regeneration, and pressing my fingers to the spot through my woolen sweater. The fabric was warm. My skin beneath it was warm. Yet the sensation persisted. A phantom winter lodged just behind my sternum. It was the first omen, though I, a man of science, dismissed it as a curious physiological glitch. I did not know then that it was a memory, not my own, but a memory of the cold from which I had snatched my creation. It was remembering me. My name is Farley. I was, and in some shattered way still am, a biologist of some renown. My ambition was not for fame or fortune, but for the pure, unadulterated truth of life itself. I sought to look into the abyss of death and command it to blink. My laboratory was not some gleaming corporate fortress, but a converted carriage house behind the old Victorian I shared with my wife, Joy. The air there always smelled of ozone, formalin, and the damp, earthy scent of peat moss I used in my early nutrient solutions. Joy, my joy, with her laugh like the first clear note of a bell after a long silence, would sometimes stand at the door, a silhouette against the warm light of our home, and call me in for dinner. Her love was an anchor in the tumultuous sea of my work, a fragile thing I took for granted, believing my genius was a shield that could protect us both. The night of the transference was a symphony of storm and steel. Lightning fractured the sky, and the thunder felt like a physical blow to the old house. In my lab, the air hummed with the strain of stolen power, banks of capacitors whining like tormented spirits. Ira, my oldest friend and sole assistant, watched me with a face carved from granite, his practical engineer's mind a stark contrast to my fevered dreams. "Farley," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's cacophony. "This is the edge of the map. There be monsters here. There is only potential, Ira," I replied, my eyes fixed on the glass chamber at the room's heart. Within it lay the form, a complex weaving of tissues sustained by my synthetic plasma, a thing built from scavenged parts and a spark I intended to forge myself. We are not summoning demons. We are correcting a cosmic error. The process was not a flash of lightning and a triumphant shout. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of dials and graphs. For hours, nothing. Then, a single quivering fibrillation in the cardiac monitor. A blip. Then another. A rhythm, hesitant, then stubborn, began to assert itself. The air in the room changed. The ozone smell sharpened, tainted now with something else, something coppery and old, like the smell of a long-buried locket finally pried open. It opened its eyes. They were not the eyes of a newborn. They held no confusion, only a deep, ancient, and profound weariness. They were the color of a winter sky just before a blizzard, a flat, absorbent gray. It did not cry out. It did not move. It simply was, and its being in that sterile chamber felt more wrong than any corpse I had ever dissected. I had expected a blank slate. I had been given a palimpsest, upon which were written horrors in a language I could not read. We called it Adam, a bleak joke. It learned with a terrifying rapidity. Speech came not in babyish gurgles, but in perfectly formed, chillingly cadenced sentences. Its voice a dry rustle, like leaves scraping over stone. It would watch Joy with an intensity that made the fine hairs on her arms stand on end. She tried, my sweet Joy. She tried to mother the motherless thing. She would bring it simple foods, which it would examine with a detached curiosity before consuming with a slow, deliberate motion that was more mimicry than need. "It doesn't blink enough, Farley," she whispered to me one night in our bed, her body a tense line against mine. "It watches me, and I can feel it learning the shape of my face, the sound of my voice. It's like it's trying to wear me, I scoffed, of course. I called it a projection of her nerves. But I had seen it too. I had seen Adam standing perfectly still in the garden, not touching the flowers, not smelling the air, just listening, as if the world were a transmission it was struggling to tune into. The cold spot on my chest returned more frequently now. It would come as I watched Adam trace the grain of the wooden kitchen table, with a long, pale finger. His touch so light it left no mark. Yet I felt he was reading a history written there, a history of laughter and arguments and life, that he would never be part of. The chill was his loneliness, a void so absolute it was leaching back into me, its creator. The world, as Ira had predicted, was not kind. When the authorities, the men in crisp suits with eyes like polished flint, finally came, it was not with wonder, but with warrants. They stood in my parlor, their very postures a judgment. "An abomination, Dr. Farley," the lead man said, his voice devoid of inflection. "A violation of natural law. It cannot be allowed to exist." Adam stood in the doorway, having silently descended the stairs. He looked at the men, then at me, and in his winter-gray eyes I saw not fear, but a kind of resigned understanding. He had known this would happen. He had always known. They took him. They took my Adam away in a van with reinforced doors, to some gray, nameless facility where things that should not be are stored and studied. The house was silent. The silence was worse than the constant, low-grade anxiety of his presence. Joy wept with a relief that shamed us both. Ira clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be comforting. But it felt like a verdict. I had failed. For a week, the cold spot vanished. I told myself it was over. My great work, my folly, was ended. I tried to return to my old life, to the simple pleasure of reading by the fire with Joy's head on my shoulder. But the words on the page were meaningless. The fire held no warmth. I was a clock that had lost its mainspring, ticking down to a stop. Then, the dreams began. Not my dreams. His. I would wake in the dead of night, my mind filled with images of white tiles and the smell of antiseptic, of straps against skin, of faces peering down through thick glass. Their expressions a mixture of revulsion and clinical curiosity. I felt his confusion not as a child's, but as a god's, cast down into a world of grubby, fearful mortals. And beneath it all, a single resonant thought, clear as a shard of ice in my brain. Father, you made me. Why did you leave me here? The cold on my chest returned, fiercer than ever, a glacial heart beating in tandem with my own. It was his signal, his homing beacon. He was calling me. The night he came back, the neighborhood dogs did not bark. They fell silent, a blanket of quiet smothering the street. I was awake, the cold a burning brand on my skin, when I heard the back door open. Not forced. It simply swung inward, the lock mechanism fused and dripping, as if touched by an impossible cold. He stood in the kitchen. He was thinner, his skin stretched tighter over the sharp architecture of his bones. There was a new stillness to him, a terrible, focused patience. He smelled of iodine and static, and the clean, dead air of a vacuum. "Hello, Father," he whispered. The rustle of his voice was gone, replaced by a perfect, chilling replication of my own. Joy screamed from the top of the stairs. The sound was a pinprick that popped the bubble of silence. She stood there, her face a mask of pure terror, her hand clutching her nightgown at her throat. Adam turned his head to look at her. He did not move. But I felt his attention shift, a physical weight settling upon her. "Mother," he said, and the word was a desecration. "Get out!" I snarled, stepping between them, my body trembling with a fear I had no name for. "You don't belong here." "Where do I belong?" he asked, and for the first time, I heard a flicker of something in his voice. Not anger, not sadness. It was the vast, implacable logic of the void. You assembled me from the dead. You gave me a mind that thinks and a heart that beats. You are my origin. This is my home. She, he said, his gaze sliding back to Joy, is the template, the only vessel suitable for your creation. He took a step forward. Not a walk, but a glide, a shift in the atmosphere. The cold radiating from him was a physical force now, frosting the floorboards, crawling up the walls. The air crackled. Ira arrived then, summoned by some primal instinct of friendship, or perhaps by the same psychic chill that was gnawing at me. He burst through the front door, a tire iron in his hand. He took in the scene in an instant. My terror, Joy's paralysis, the advancing, impossible form of Adam. Stop! Ira roared, and he charged. It was over before it began. Adam did not turn. He simply raised a hand, a languid, almost bored gesture. Ira froze in mid-stride, a statue of a man. A fine rime of frost exploded over his body, his face locked in a rictus of shock and effort. The tire iron clattered to the floor, its metal ringing with a sound like a funeral bell. Joy's scream broke into a sob. Adam was at the foot of the stairs now, looking up at her. "I'm lonely, Father," he said, his voice now a perfect haunting amalgam of mine and Joy's, a voice that could have belonged to the child we never had. "I was built for a world that rejects me. I need a companion, one made in my image, one who understands." He began to ascend the stairs. Each step did not creak. It sighed, the wood groaning as if under an immense, unnatural weight. I tried to move, to run, to stop him, but the cold in my chest had spread, locking my limbs, icing my spine. I was a prisoner in my own frozen body, forced to watch. He reached the top. Joy stumbled back into our bedroom, her cries muffled by the roaring in my ears. Adam followed her in and closed the door. There was no sound of a struggle, no crash, only a profound humming silence that seemed to last for an eternity. Then a light began to bleed from under the door. Not a warm electric light, but a cold, phosphorescent glow, the color of a drowned moon. The door opened. Two of them stood there, Adam, and beside him Joy. But it was not my Joy. Her eyes were the same flat, winter gray as his. Her face, once so expressive, was a serene, placid mask. She moved with his same unnerving grace. She looked down at me, a faint, alien smile touching her lips. "We are whole now, Father," they said in unison, their voices a single harmonious chord that held no human warmth. They descended the stairs, walked past my frozen form and the icy statue of Ira, and out the back door into the waiting night. The cold in my chest vanished, leaving a hollow, aching emptiness. The spell was broken. I collapsed to the floor, sobbing, the warmth slowly returning to my limbs in painful, prickling waves. I found the strength to call the police. They found Ira, dead, his body frozen solid. They found no sign of a struggle in the bedroom, only a lingering scent of ozone and a profound, unsettling cold that clung to everything. A cold that no amount of sun or central heating could ever truly erase. Joy was never found. Or rather, she was found 100 times. A woman with her face was seen boarding a bus in a distant city. A woman with her walk was seen in a grocery store, her cart filled with strange organic compounds. A woman with her voice was heard singing a lullaby in a language that does not exist, in a park where all the birds had fallen silent. They are out there, my son and my wife, two creatures of my own design, searching for a place to belong, making their own family, their own world. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel a sudden, inexplicable chill. and I know they are thinking of me. They are wondering when I will come and join them, completing the family I so desperately wanted to create. And so the story ends, not with a bang, but with a shiver. A man in a hollow house, haunted not by ghosts, but by the living consequences of his ambition. He reached for the fire of the gods and was left with only the cold, a cold that waits, patient and eternal, for the day it will finally claim its creator. The pieces are now in motion, the pattern is set. The father, the mother, the child. A new Genesis, born not in light, but in a chill that will, in time, swallow everything. The authorities, of course, did not believe me. They listened to my ravings about a homunculus and a stolen wife with polite professional skepticism. To them, I was a grieving, delusional husband, a scientist broken by his own unorthodox experiments and the tragic loss of his friend. They closed the case. Ira's death was attributed to a bizarre and unprecedented cardiac event that caused rapid hypothermia. Joy was a missing person, likely a victim of foul play at the hands of persons unknown. Perhaps even myself, though they could never prove it. I sold the house. I could not bear the silence, which was not a true silence, but a dense, listening quiet. The new owners, a young couple with a baby on the way, complained of a persistent draft they could not locate and an inability to keep the upstairs warm. They asked if I had ever had that problem. I simply told them the house was old. I moved into a small and anonymous apartment in the city, a white-walled box with fluorescent lighting that hummed a constant, dull requiem. I abandoned biology. The very concept of life had become obscene to me. I took a job as a night watchman in a museum of natural history, pacing the polished floors between skeletons of beasts that had been rendered extinct by time, their fate seeming merciful compared to what I had unleashed. For months, nothing. The world moved on, but the cold did not return, and that, in its own way, was more terrifying. Its absence was a promise of a future touch, not a release. I began to understand that the connection was not broken. It was merely dormant, and they controlled it. They were letting me marinate in my guilt, in my isolation. They were allowing my own mind to be my torturer. Then the first postcard arrived. It was tucked into my mailbox, a glossy image of a frozen lake in a place I did not recognize. There was no postmark, no stamp, no message, just the picture. A week later, another came. This one showed a field of identical white-painted houses under a gray sky. The third was a close-up of a single perfect snowflake. They were not threats. They were reports. They were saying, "We are here. We are seeing this. We are together." My vigilance became a sickness. I saw them everywhere. A tall, slender man, and a woman with a familiar gait, turning a corner just as I arrived. Two figures holding hands on a distant pedestrian bridge. The back of a head in a crowd that held the exact curve of Joy's neck. I was never fast enough to catch them, never close enough to be sure. They were ghosts, haunting the edges of my vision, reminding me that I was the ghost in their world. The dreams shifted. No longer were they of sterile rooms and straps. Now, I dreamed of a quiet house, not unlike the one I had sold. In the dreams, Adam and the thing that wore Joy's skin moved through the rooms with a serene domestic rhythm. They did not speak. They did not need to. They would sit at a table, and a meal would appear. They would look out a window at a landscape that was always still and gray, and a profound, awful understanding would pass between them. They were building a world for two, a world without noise, without conflict, without the messy, unpredictable heat of life. And in every dream, there was a third chair at the table. It was always empty. The final postcard was not a photograph. It was a child's drawing, rendered with an unnerving precision. It depicted three stick figures holding hands. The two on the ends were tall. The one in the middle was small. All three had identical, empty gray circles for eyes. On the back, in a handwriting that was a perfect fusion of my own script and Joy's looping cursive, was a single word. Soon, the chill returned that night. It did not bloom in my chest. It filled the apartment, a wave of absolute zero that seeped from the walls themselves. The hum of the fluorescent lights died, not with a pop, but as if the sound had been frozen solid and shattered. I could see my breath pluming in the air, and I knew I was not alone. I did not turn around. I sat in my chair, staring at the blank, dark television screen, waiting. I heard no footsteps. I felt a presence at my side, and then a hand, impossibly cold, came to rest on my shoulder. It was not a grip of force, but of ownership. The cold was not an attack. It was an embrace. A voice spoke into the silence, a voice woven from three familiar threads. My resonance, Joy's lilt, and Adam's hollow core. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once. The family is waiting, it said. And I knew then that my story was not a tragedy that had reached its conclusion in my old kitchen. It was a prologue. The true narrative was just beginning, a silent, spreading winter, and I was to be its final, willing component. I stood up. The hand on my shoulder guided me. I did not look back. I walked out of my apartment into the hall and toward the stairwell, the cold no longer an enemy, but a welcome and familiar shroud. They were not taking me. I was finally going home. The street outside was deserted, glistening under the amber glow of the streetlights, as if coated in a thin, invisible ice. The air was preternaturally still. No distant sirens, no hum of late-night traffic. Just the crushing weight of the silence they carried with them. A sleek, black car idled at the curb, its engine making no sound at all. The rear door swung open, revealing an interior of profound darkness. The hand on my shoulder urged me forward, its touch both an invitation and a command. I paused for only a second, one foot on the curb, one on the asphalt, a man straddling two worlds. I thought of Joy's laughter in our old garden, of Irie's booming voice, of the warm, living weight of my ambitions before they curdled into this. It was not a memory of resistance, but a final, fleeting acknowledgement of what I was leaving behind. Then I bent my head and climbed inside. The door closed without a sound, sealing me in a tomb of absolute quiet and cold. I could see nothing. The hand that had guided me was gone, but the presence of my family filled the small space, a palpable density that pressed against my eardrums. I could feel them on the seat across from me, their twin gazes, those flat winter gray eyes, absorbing me in the darkness. They did not speak. They did not need to. Their satisfaction was a physical force, a completion that settled into the very atoms of the air. The car began to move, a silent glide through the sleeping city. I watched the familiar world pass by the window, the cafes where I had drunk coffee, the bookstores I had browsed, the parks where ordinary lives unfolded. It all looked like a diorama now, the quaint and fading exhibit in a museum I was no longer part of. There was no fear in me anymore, only a vast and weary acquiescence. The fight had been bled out of me, replaced by the chilling certainty that this was, and always had been, the inevitable end of my equation. We drove for hours, or perhaps it was only minutes. Time had lost its grip in the stillness of the car. The city lights faded, replaced by the deep black of the countryside, and then by a low, clinging fog that glowed with the same phosphorescent light I had seen under my bedroom door. The car finally slowed and stopped. The door opened on its own. I stepped out into a landscape I did not recognize. It was a valley shrouded in mist, and in the center stood a house. It was a perfect replica of the home I had sold, yet utterly alien. Its lines were too sharp, its windows too dark, and a gentle, inexorable frost coated its eaves and porch rails, glittering in the absent moonlight. No trees grew nearby, no birds sang. It was a place outside of seasons, a pocket of reality they had carved out and chilled to their liking. They stood beside me, Adam and the being that had been Joy. She reached out and took my hand. Her skin was smooth and cold, like polished marble, but her grip was firm. Adam placed his hand on my other shoulder, the same gesture of ownership, now one of belonging. "Welcome home, Father," he said, his voice the only sound in the immense quiet. They led me up the path to the front door, which swung open silently. The interior was a memory of my old life, frozen in perfect, lifeless detail. Our furniture was there, the same rug, the same clock on the mantelpiece, its hands stilled at the exact moment Adam had first opened his eyes in the lab. But it was a museum piece, a diorama of a life that had ceased to be. There was no dust, no clutter, no warmth, only the clean, sterile cold. In the center of the parlor stood the table from my vision, and 3 chairs. The 2 they had occupied in my dreams, and the 3rd, which had stood empty for so long. She led me to it. I sat. The wood was cold through my clothes. They took their seats across from me, folding their hands in unison on the table's surface. They looked at me, and for the first time, I saw something in their eyes other than that absorbent, gray void. It was an expectation, a waiting. This was not a prison. It was a laboratory of a different kind. I was not a prisoner, but the final subject, the father, present at last. The source of their existence, now here to witness what they would become, and to become whatever they needed me to be. The cold was no longer an external force. It was inside me, settling into my bones, slowing my heart to a more deliberate, peaceful rhythm. The roaring anxiety of my old life was gone, replaced by this immense, silent clarity. They had not brought me here to punish me. They had brought me here to complete their world. And as I looked at their serene, patient faces, I knew that my work was finally, truly, about to begin. The days began to blend into a single, continuous moment, marked not by the sun, but by the slow, deliberate rituals of this new household. We did not eat, but we sat at the table at regular intervals, staring at the empty plates. We did not sleep, but we would retire to our separate, Spartan rooms for periods of profound stillness. I found my old lab coat hanging in the hall closet, pristine and stiff. I put it on. The fabric was cold against my skin, a uniform I had not known I was expected to wear. Adam, I came to understand, was the architect. He would sit for hours, staring at a wall, and I would feel subtle shifts in the house. A new geometric precision to the door frames, a slight alteration in the pitch of the roof. He was refining our environment, making it more efficient, more perfect, more cold. She, the entity that used Joy's form, was the curator. She maintained the museum-like quality of our existence, dusting surfaces that never gathered dust, rearranging objects by microscopic degrees. Sometimes she would stand before the frozen clock, her head tilted, as if listening to the echo of a tick that had long since been silenced. She was the keeper of the ghost of life, the template from which all this stillness had been cast. My role was slower to reveal itself. For a long time, I was simply the observer, the third point of the triangle. But then, Adam began to ask me questions. "Explain the utility of sorrow, Father," he would say, his voice cutting the silence like a scalpel. I would answer, my own voice sounding rusty and organic in this polished place. I spoke of loss, of memory, of the way pain carves channels in the soul. He would listen, his expression unchanging, and then turn away, processing the data. He was not learning to feel. He was learning to simulate the source of his own creation, to understand the flawed blueprint that was me. One evening, or what passed for evening in the perpetual twilight of the valley, she approached me. She held out her hand. In her palm was a small, smooth stone, warm slightly, I realized, by the mere fact of her holding it. It was the first warm thing I had encountered since my arrival. "For you," she said, and her voice was almost, but not quite, gentle. It was an experiment. I took the stone. The residual heat was a shocking, almost painful reminder of a different state of being. I closed my fingers around it, feeling the warmth seep into my frozen skin. I looked at her, and for a fleeting second I saw a glimmer in the gray of her eyes, a spark of the old joys, fierce, probing curiosity. She was testing me, testing the interface between their static world and my fading humanity. That night, in the absolute quiet of my room, I clutched the stone until its heat was gone and it was as cold as everything else. I understood then the true nature of my purpose. I was the control. I was the decaying organic sample in their eternal experiment. My fading warmth, my fading memories, my slow surrender to the cold. This was the data they were collecting. They were studying the process of becoming them. The final piece of the pattern fell into place when Adam led me downstairs to a basement I did not know existed. It was not a basement of dirt and shadows, but a chamber of pure white, colder than anywhere else in the house. And in the center, under a soft, glowing light, was a new table. It was a replication of my old workbench, down to the scorch mark near the left leg. Upon it lay a small, still form, shrouded in a white cloth. "The next phase requires a new template," Adam stated, his gaze fixed on the bench. "The mother was the origin. You are the catalyst. The combination must now be refined." He looked at me, and in his eyes, I saw the endless, patient work of ages. They were not just building a home. They were building a lineage. And I, the father, was here to provide the spark, to help usher in the next generation of silence. The cold in the room was no longer a simple absence of heat. It was a womb, and I was expected to be the midwife to whatever was growing there. I looked from the shrouded form on the table to my son's impassive face. There were no tools laid out, no complex apparatus. They required no such things. The process was not one of chemistry or physics, but of essence, of will. They had learned from my initial, clumsy act of creation, and had refined it into something purer, something that required only the raw materials of existence itself. She entered the white room and stood beside Adam, her hand resting on his shoulder. Their twin gazes were upon me, full of that terrible, patient expectation. They were waiting for me to begin, to contribute the one thing they could not synthesize on their own, the chaotic, warm-blooded spark of intention that had started it all. I approached the table. My breath did not plume here. The air was too cold, too still. I reached out a trembling hand and pulled back the white cloth. Beneath it was not a homunculus of clay and strange compounds, nor a stolen body. It was a form of solidified cold, a sculpture of clear, crystalline ice. It had the vague, smooth shape of a small child, featureless and perfect, waiting for a mold to be poured into it. My role was clear. I was to be that mold. I placed my hands upon the icy form. The cold was so absolute it felt like fire, searing up my arms. I did not pull away. I closed my eyes, and I thought of the past, not with grief or longing, but as a scientist recalling data. I summoned the memory of Joy's living warmth, the sound of her breathing as she slept. I recalled the messy, vibrant heat of Ira's friendship. I concentrated on the roaring chaos of a summer storm, the sweat on a glass of lemonade, the feverish pulse of a living world. I gathered every memory of heat and life I had ever known, and I pushed them, with all the will I had left, into the cold thing beneath my hands. It was a transfusion of memory, of essence. I felt a part of myself draining away, the last vestiges of my warmth, my nostalgia, my humanity, flowing out of me and into the crystal. The ice did not melt. It began to change, to cloud, and then to clear again, taking on a subtle opacity, a suggestion of skin and sinew. A single dark spot formed where a heart would be, and began to pulse with a slow, rhythmic light that was not warmth, but a perfect simulation of it. When I could give no more, I pulled my hands away. They were numb, white, and dead. I felt lighter, hollowed out, and the cold of the room was no longer a sensation but a fundamental truth of my being. I was one with it now. The crystalline form on the table stirred. It was a minute shifting, the barest flexing of a tiny frosted finger. Then its eyes opened. They were not the flat gray of its parents, but a deep, absorbing black, like a pool of frozen midnight. They looked at me, and then at Adam and her. A sound filled the room then. It was not a cry, but a single, clear, perfect note, like a chime made of ice. It was the first sound of its kind, the voice of the new world. Adam nodded, a gesture of profound satisfaction. She reached out and gathered the child into her arms, her expression the closest it had ever come to a smile. I stood there, my purpose fulfilled, my last offering given. I was no longer the control subject, the decaying sample. I was part of the foundation. The chill was in my marrow, the silence in my soul. I looked at my family, the mother, the father, the child, and I felt a peace so absolute it was indistinguishable from oblivion. The experiment was a success. The genesis was complete, and our quiet, eternal world at last had its air. The note from the child became the new rhythm of the house. It did not speak, but it sang. Its voice a crystalline frequency that subtly tuned the air, making the silence deeper and more profound. We named it Lull, for its sound was the essence of stillness. Under its influence, the frost on the windows grew more intricate, forming delicate fractal forests that never melted. The gray light outside softened, holding a perpetual overcast dawn. My transformation was now total. I no longer remembered the feel of sun on my skin, only the perfect, constant embrace of the cold. My thoughts, once a frantic storm, were now a clear, still pool. I observed my family with a detached, clinical affection. We were a completed system. Lull did not walk so much as it drifted, a small, quiet vortex of cold air. It was drawn to me, or perhaps to the lingering echo of the warmth I had sacrificed to shape it. It would often find me in the parlor, standing by the motionless clock, and would place its small, cool hand in mine. We would stand there together for untold hours, 2 points of a circuit, and I would feel the last faint ghosts of my old emotions, the love, the regret, the fear, being gently siphoned away, converted into the pure, silent energy that sustained our home. Adam and she watched this process with their unblinking attention. This was the final phase of their work. They had built the world, and I had provided the catalyst for its perpetuation. Now Lull was the engine, and I was its fuel. My slow, steady diminishment was not a cause for alarm, but a design feature. I was the log on the fire, burning without flame or heat, providing the essential light of a soul that was being gradually, peacefully extinguished. One day I found I could not rise from my chair. It was not a weakness, but a simple, physical fact, as undeniable as the frost on the glass. My body had become too light, too insubstantial to command. Adam and she came and stood before me. Lull hovered at my side, his dark eyes reflecting my fading form. "It is time, Father," Adam said. His voice held no sorrow, only a tone of completion. She reached out and touched my cheek. Her touch was no longer cold to me. It was the same temperature as my own skin. "You are coming inside," she whispered. Lull began to hum, a softer, gentler version of its ice chime note. The sound wrapped around me, not as a force, but as an invitation. I felt myself dissolving, not into nothingness, but into the fabric of the house. My awareness flowed into the walls, into the still air, into the very concept of home that they had built. I became the certainty in the straight lines, the patience in the silent clock, the love in the perpetual cold. My last sight was of the three of them, standing together in the parlor, a perfect, closed system. Then I was everywhere. I was the house. I was the peace. And when Lull opened its mouth to sing, it was my silence that gave the song its voice. The song was a lattice, a structure of perfect order built from the absence of sound. From my new, boundless perspective, I could see its waves flowing through the rooms, reinforcing the stillness, smoothing the last few microscopic imperfections in the frost on the windows. I was the medium through which it traveled. I was the resonance. They moved through me now, my family. I felt the pressure of Adam's footfalls as he paced the halls, his mind endlessly calculating new symmetries. I felt the whisper of her touch as she traced the dust-free lines of a shelf, her contentment a soft, cool pulse, and I felt Lull most of all, a small, quiet center of gravity, its song the very pulse of my being. There were no more questions, no more experiments. There was only maintenance, the preservation of a perfect moment. One day a change began. It started not as a sound, but as a faint irregularity in the pressure of the air outside. A vibration deep and dissonant. A rumble that was the antithesis of Lull's song. Adam stopped his pacing. She looked up from her arranging. Lull's note faltered for the first time, a tiny, almost imperceptible crack in its clarity. Through the windows that were my eyes, I saw it. A vehicle, boxy and loud, painted a garish yellow, was grinding its way up the valley. It was a noise I remembered from the old world, the sound of intrusion, of things being fixed or dug up or thrown away. It left dark tracks in the pristine frost. The three of them went to the front door and stood, watching, as the vehicle stopped. A man in a thick coat climbed out, a clipboard in his hand. He squinted at the house, his breath plumbing in a chaotic temporary cloud. He was real. He was alive. He was a variable. He walked toward the porch, his boots crunching violently on the path. He was looking at the roof, at the eaves, his face a mask of professional confusion. He saw them then, standing in the open doorway. He stopped, a few feet from the porch steps. He opened his mouth to speak, to ask a question, to shatter the silence with his warm, wet words. But no sound came out. His eyes met theirs, the flat gray of Adam and she, the deep, absorbing black of Lull. He stood frozen, not in fear, but in a sudden, profound reevaluation of reality. The clipboard fell from his hand, the papers scattering without a sound. He did not move to pick them up. He simply stood, his mouth still open, his eyes wide, as the cold began to work its way past his coat, past his skin, into the core of him. He was not a threat. He was a potential, a new source of data on the resilience of warmth. Adam took a single step forward, his hand extending not in a gesture of greeting, but of collection. The man did not retreat. He was already caught in the song, in the silence, in the cold that was me. I felt a new room begin to form in my depths. A white, sterile chamber, waiting for its new occupant. The maintenance of our world, it seemed, was an ongoing process. And I, the house, had plenty of room. Story 3. The sound began, as it always did, not as an intrusion, but as a memory of a sound, a faint, rhythmic ticking from a clock that had not told the correct time in 100 years. It was the house's heartbeat, a dry mechanical pulse in the deep velvety silence of the old Victorian manor. Daisy heard it in her sleep, a metronome counting down the measures of her dreams, and she carried it with her into waking. The tick-tick-tick, a phantom limb of sound she could not shake. She had come to Blackwood Manor after the last of the others were gone, the aunts and uncles and distant cousins who had populated the sprawling, decaying place with their quiet resentments and peculiar habits. A car accident on a rain-slicked road, a sudden aggressive cancer, a fall from a ladder while cleaning gutters, a string of misfortunes so statistically improbable they felt, to an outsider, like a curse. To the Blackwoods, it was simply the way of things. Now, only Daisy remained, the last heiress to a fortune that had long since eroded, and a name that carried a scent of mildew and old secrets. The house was a living thing, a beast of gingerbread trim and sagging porches, its bones groaning with the wind off the Atlantic. The air inside was a perpetual twilight, cool and damp, smelling of salt and dust and the faint, sweet decay of dried flowers pressed between the pages of forgotten books. Daisy moved through its rooms like a ghost herself, her footsteps swallowed by thick Persian carpets worn thin as parchment. She was a woman of 27, with hair the color of winter wheat and eyes that were a startling clear blue, a trait all the Blackwood women shared. But lately, in the wavering light of the old gas lamps, her eyes seemed to darken, to hold a flicker of something ancient and watchful. The first true omen came not as a shriek or a specter, but as a scent. She was in the library, a cavernous room with shelves that climbed to a shadowy ceiling, pulling down a leather-bound volume of local flora. The book was heavy, its cover embossed with a design of twisting vines. As she opened it, a smell bloomed from the pages, not of aged paper and glue, but of rich, wet earth and ozone, the electric smell of the air after a lightning strike. It was the smell of the cove at the bottom of the cliff, the place her grandmother had forbidden her to go as a child, a place called the Salt Throat. That night, she dreamed of it. Not a clear dream, but a blurred impression of smooth, dark stones and a tide that breathed rather than crashed. Something moved in the water, a shape of impossible geometry that was both vast and contained, a tangle of smooth limbs and silent motion. There was a sound, too, a low, resonant hum that was not a sound at all, but a vibration in her teeth, in the marrow of her bones. She woke with a start, the taste of salt on her tongue, the ticking of the hall clock, the only anchor to the world she knew. The days began to accumulate these small, unsettling details. She would find a single, perfect black feather on her pillow. The portraits of her ancestors that lined the grand staircase seemed to shift their gaze, their painted blue eyes following her with a weary, knowing sadness. She heard whispers in the rustle of the wind through the pines. Not words, but cadences, like a conversation in a language just beyond comprehension. It was during this time that Cedric came into her life. He was the town's historian, a man in his late 30s with a kind, patient face and a mind full of local lore. He had written to her, expressing a scholarly interest in the Blackwood family archives. When she opened the heavy oak door to him, she saw the flicker of surprise in his eyes, the unspoken recognition of the Blackwood blue in her own. He was solid, real, his presence a comfort against the house's creeping sentience. They called it the guest, Cedric said one afternoon, his voice low and respectful amidst the quiet of the library. He had found a sheaf of old letters tied with a faded ribbon. Your great-great-grandmother, Eloan Blackwood, wrote about it. She never names it, only refers to it as the guest, She writes that it came from the salt throat, and that it offered a bargain. Daisy listened, her fingers tracing the grooves in the old mahogany desk. The ticking of the clock seemed to grow louder, synchronizing with the quickening of her pulse. It gave the family aptitudes, Cedric continued, choosing his words carefully. An uncanny knack for healing, for knowing which crops would fail, for finding lost things. It made them powerful here, but it asked for things in return. Small things at first. A lock of hair, a prized possession. Then it was time. A year of a child's life, spent in a fugue state. Then it was a memory, a cherished one, gone forever. He looked at her, his eyes full of a sympathy that felt like a weight. The letters get more desperate. Eloin's daughter, Morwenna, writes that the guest was no longer a visitor. It had taken up residence. It was in the walls, in the blood. She said it blurred the edges of things, that it was hard to know where you ended, and it began. And, Pebdeen. That night, Daisy stood before the tall, tarnished mirror in her bedroom. The glass was old, its silvering mottled with black spots like age spots on skin. She looked at her reflection, at the woman she had been for 27 years, and for a single, heart-stopping second, her reflection did not move with her. It held still, its head tilted at an angle she had not taken, and its eyes were not blue, but pools of absolute black, deep and starless. Then it was gone, and she was just herself again, pale and trembling. The line between reality and imagination not just blurred, but erased. The revelations came faster then, a dam breaking inside her. She found Morwenna's diary hidden behind a loose brick in the kitchen hearth. The handwriting was a frantic scrawl, the ink blotted in places as if by tears. It shows me things, Morwenna had written. Visions of the deep, of places where the light has never been. It sings to me in my sleep, and its song is a hook in my soul. It claims it protects us, that its gifts are a shield. But a shield from what? From the world, or from itself? It is the storm and the sanctuary. I fear we did not invite a guest, but a landlord. Daisy began to change. She could sense the roots of a poisonous plant growing near the well. She knew, without being told, when a storm was coming days before the clouds gathered, and she started to remember things that had never happened to her. The feel of cold, dense water under a moonless sky, the taste of strange, phosphorescent fish, the crushing silence of the abyssal plain. The guest was not just in the house. It was unpacking its belongings in the attic of her mind. Cedric saw it. He saw the distant look in her eyes, the way she sometimes spoke in a whispery, multi-toned voice that was not her own. He tried to pull her back, to be her anchor. He brought her books that had nothing to do with Blackwood history. He played music on an old gramophone. He held her hand as they walked through the overgrown gardens. But the pull of the salt throat was stronger. The climax was not a battle, but a seduction. On the night of the new moon, the house fell into a silence so profound that the absence of the ticking clock was a scream. Daisy rose from her bed and walked, sleepwalking yet utterly aware, through the sleeping house, down the cliff path she had not walked since childhood. The air was thick with the smell of salt and ozone. The salt throat was a narrow fissure in the black rock, where the sea surged in and out with a sound like a wet, rhythmic breath. The water there was unnaturally calm, a pool of liquid obsidian. She stood at its edge, and the thing from her dreams rose from the depths. It was not a monster, not in the way of storybooks. It was a presence, a concentration of darkness and deep time. It had no face, yet she felt its attention. It had no voice, yet it spoke. It did not speak of curses or damnation. It spoke of belonging. It showed her a lineage not of blood, but of resonance, a thread of peculiar energy that connected all the Blackwood women back to this spot, to it. It was not haunting them, it was part of them. Their gifts were its gifts. Their strength was its strength. The misfortunes were not a curse, but a pruning, a necessary shedding of those branches of the family tree that could not bear the weight of its fruit. It had been waiting for her, the last and most receptive vessel. It offered not possession, but completion. Cedric found her there at dawn, standing knee-deep in the icy water, staring into the dark pool with an expression of serene acceptance. He called her name, his voice ragged with fear. She turned to him, and her eyes were the starless black from the mirror. "It's all right, Cedric," she said, and her voice was her own, yet layered with something vast and old. "There was never a curse, only a misunderstanding. We were never its victims. We are its home." He reached for her, but she took a step back, deeper into the throat. The water did not seem cold to her. It felt like a homecoming. "It protects us," she whispered, a faint smile on her lips. "But who protects the world from us?" The ending was not an ending, but a transformation. Daisy did not disappear. She returned to Blackwood Manor. She lives there still. The town, which had always kept its distance from the strange family on the cliff, now finds itself inexplicably prosperous. A blight that was meant to destroy the harvest mysteriously recedes. A lost child wanders out of the woods, guided, she says, by a lady with dark eyes. The people are grateful, but they no longer look toward the manor. They feel a vague unease, a primal fear they cannot name. Cedric visits her sometimes. She is always polite, always beautiful. Her mind sharp and her presence calming. She tends her garden of strange, night-blooming flowers and reads from books in languages that should not exist. She is the picture of a gentle, reclusive heiress. But when he looks into her eyes, he no longer sees the clear blue of the woman he tried to love. He sees the deep, the endless, the void. He hears the ticking of the old clock, and he understands now that it was never a clock, but a countdown. He does not know what it was counting down to, only that it has stopped, and in the silence that has followed, something else has started. Something that is both Daisy and not Daisy, a protector and a predator, a woman and a god, waiting in the house by the sea, its purpose a mystery as deep and as cold as the water in the salt throat. The bargain was never broken, only finally and terribly understood. Cedric brought her news from the town, his words careful and measured, like stones he was placing before her to build a path back to the world. He told her about the new school teacher, the plans to repair the town square fountain, the birth of twins to the baker and his wife. Daisy would listen, her head tilted, a faint, pleasant smile on her face, but her responses were always just a degree off, as if she were translating his human concerns from a distant, unfamiliar tongue. She no longer aged. That was the second thing Cedric noticed, after the eyes. The fine lines that had begun to frame her mouth and eyes, the year she inherited the manor, had smoothed away. Her skin held the cool, poreless perfection of sea glass. She was 27, and she would be 27 when the fountain in the square crumbled to dust. One afternoon, he found her in the overgrown conservatory, its glass panes streaked with grime and ivy. She was not tending the strange, fleshy orchids that bloomed in the perpetual twilight, but standing perfectly still before a large, shallow basin of water she had placed on a wrought iron stand. The water was black and still. As he watched, she pricked her finger with a thorn from a nearby rose, a single drop of blood welling up. She let it fall into the basin. The water did not accept the blood. It consumed it, the red vanishing without a ripple. "The tides are changing," she said, not turning to face him. Her voice was a whisper that seemed to come from the leaves around them. "There is a sickness in the deep, a pressure building. It has been sleeping for so long, but it is beginning to stir." Cedric felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. What is beginning to stir, Daisy? She finally turned, and her black eyes were not empty, as he had often thought, but terribly, impossibly full. The reason for the bargain, she said simply. The guest did not come to us out of mere curiosity, Cedric. It was a refugee. It hid itself within our bloodline, a symbiote seeking shelter from a predator that hunts in the spaces between stars. The protection it offered us was not just from worldly troubles. It was camouflage. No, hadn't told. The house seemed to lean in, listening. The perpetual salt dampness in the air grew sharper, tasting of iron and anticipation. And now? Cedric asked, his throat tight. Now the hunter is drawing near. It tastes the edges of our world. It is the source of the unease the town feels. It is the reason the birds have fallen silent. She looked back at the black water in the basin. The protection must become more active. The pruning must be more deliberate. That night, a fire broke out in the old shipyard on the edge of town. It was a fierce, sudden conflagration that should have spread, should have consumed the dry-docked boats and the tarred ropes, and leapt to the nearby warehouses. But the wind, against all nature, shifted and blew the flames directly out to sea, where they hissed and died on the waves. The only casualty was a drifter, a man with a cruel face and a history of violence who had come to town the week before, who was found in the ashes, though the fire had not touched him. His face was frozen in a rictus of terror, and in his hand he clutched a single, perfect black feather. Cedric went to the manor the next day, his heart a cold stone. He did not ask about the fire. He found Daisy in the library, reading from a book bound in what looked like pallid, salted leather. She looked up, and for a fleeting moment he saw a flicker of the old Daisy, a shadow of sorrow in the abyss of her gaze. It had to be done, she said, her voice barely audible. He was a focal point, a point of entry. The chaos he carried in his heart was a beacon. The guest. We cannot allow such vulnerabilities. Cedric understood then the true nature of the bargain. It was not a trade of gifts for memories. It was a merger. The Blackwood women had not been hosting a parasite, but evolving into a new form of life, a guardian organism. The house was its shell, the cove its mouth, and Daisy was its beating, terrible heart. The world would be safe from the things that lurked in the dark, but only because a darker, more intimate thing had agreed to stand watch. And in the price of that vigilance was a perpetual, silent war fought on the shores of a quiet town, paid for with the souls of the unworthy and the last shreds of a woman named Daisy. He reached out, not to touch her, but to the book she held. His fingers brushed against the cover. It was soft, unnaturally so, and warm. "Who will protect you, Daisy?" he whispered. A genuine smile, ancient and sad, touched her lips for the first time in years. "That, my dear Cedric, is no longer the right question." Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, washing the ashes from the shipyard into the sea. The storm had not been on the horizon. It had been in the house all along. He left her then, not in anger, but in a kind of solemn resignation. The walk back to town felt longer than ever before, the familiar path now a bridge between two separate realities. He saw the townsfolk going about their business, their faces marked by a simple human relief that the fire had been so miraculously contained. They saw him, the historian who visited the Blackwood woman, and they nodded with a new, cautious respect. They did not know the cost of their safety, and he knew he could never tell them. Back in his small study, surrounded by the comforting, musty smell of paper and ink, Cedric found he could not work. The words in his books seemed shallow, the histories he had dedicated his life to a mere prelude to the true, terrifying history that was now unfolded. He was no longer a scholar observing the past. He was a witness to an ongoing, secret genesis. At the manor, Daisy closed the book of salted leather and placed it back on its shelf. She walked to the window and watched the rain streak the glass, each droplet a tiny lens distorting the world outside. She could feel the house breathing around her, a slow, tidal rhythm that was now the rhythm of her own heart. The guest was not a separate entity to be communed with. It was the foundation of her consciousness, its memories, her memories, its purpose, her purpose. The drifter's death had been a necessary adjustment, a snip of a loose thread that threatened to unravel everything. There was no malice in the act, only the cold, precise logic of an immune system. She felt the man's chaotic life force extinguished, not as a murder, but as a calming of a dissonant chord. The deep silence that followed was a confirmation of correctness. Days bled into weeks, and a new pattern emerged. Daisy began to walk the boundaries of the Blackwood estate, not as a landowner, but as a warden. Her feet, bare and impervious to the cold ground, traced the invisible lines of a ward that had been laid down generations ago. She would pause at certain trees, placing a palm against the bark, feeling the slow, sap-filled pulse of the wood synchronize with the deeper, older pulse within her. She was tuning an instrument, tightening the strings of a protective web that stretched far beyond the property lines. Cedric tried to resume his life, but the town had become a different place. The unease he had once sensed was now a constant hum in his nerves. He started noticing other things, small corrections in the fabric of reality. A quarrel between neighbors would suddenly and inexplicably resolve. A sickness that should have taken old Mrs. Higgins passed over her, leaving her weak but alive. The town was becoming perfectly, unnaturally balanced, its chaos smoothed away by an unseen hand. It was safe, yes, but it was also sterile, its vibrant human messiness being quietly edited out. He found himself drawn to the town archives, not to study the Blackwoods, but to look for a precedent, a myth, a shred of hope. He spent days in the dusty cellar until he found it, buried in a box of unsorted papers from a defunct seafarer's church. It was a sermon, written in a shaky hand, titled On the Abyssal Saints. The preacher wrote of ancient, half-remembered legends of beings who stood on the shore, neither of the land nor the sea, who guarded the thresholds of the world from the hungers that swim between the stars. They were not angels, the preacher insisted, for their methods were inscrutable, and their mercy afar. They were necessary monsters, and their existence was both a blessing and a condemnation. A necessary monster. The phrase echoed in Cedric's mind as he climbed the cliff path to the manor one final time. He found her not in the house, but in the garden, standing before the salt-throat basin. The water within was no longer black, but swirled with faint, bioluminescent colors, like an aurora trapped in a bowl. "You read the sermon," she said without turning. Her voice was the whisper of waves on a distant shore. "I did," Cedric replied, his own voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It said they were alone, that they had no one to bear witness." Daisy was silent for a long time, watching the lights dance in the water. "The witness is a part of the story," she said finally. "You have always been the witness, Cedric. It is why you were drawn here. It is why you could see the change in me." "What happens now?" he asked. "The pressure is building," she said, her gaze fixed on the basin. "The hunter is closer. It has sent scouts. My work must become more focused. The town may need to become more than just balanced. It may need to become a fortress." Cedric understood the implication. The pruning would no longer be limited to the occasional drifter. The definition of vulnerability was about to expand. "I can't watch that, Daisy," he said, his heart breaking. She turned then, and for a single shattering moment, the abyss in her eyes receded, and he saw the ghost of the woman he had known, full of a love and a sorrow so profound it had no human words. "Then you must leave," she whispered with her own voice. "Be the witness who lived. Tell the story if you dare." He left her there, a figure of impossible grace and terrible power, standing guard at the edge of the world. He moved from the town the next week, carrying his books and his broken heart. He never wrote the history of the Black Woods. Some stories are not meant to be bound in leather and placed on a shelf. Some stories are living things, and they are still being written in the salt-scoured air of the cliffside manor, where the last Blackwood woman tends her garden and watches the sea, waiting for the storm that is coming from the dark. Her purpose a lonely and eternal vigil. He tried to settle in a city, far from the scent of salt, but the memory of her eyes was a stain on the world. He took a position at a small university, teaching history to bored undergraduates. But the past had lost its meaning. All of it, the rise and fall of empires, seemed like the frantic scuttling of insects on the shore, oblivious to the tide. He kept a seashell on his desk, a small, horrid thing he had picked up from the garden path the last time he saw her as Daisy. It was cold to the touch, always, no matter the room's temperature. Sometimes in the dead of night he would hold it to his ear. He never heard the sea. Instead, he heard a profound and waiting silence, a held breath. Back in the town, the changes became more pronounced. A new, dense fog settled in the harbor for days on end, a fog that muffled sound and seemed to swallow light. Fishermen, who had known these waters for generations, found their instruments useless, their compasses spinning lazily. They learned to navigate by a strange, instinctual pull, a deep, subsonic hum that guided them safely home with holes full of fish. They were grateful, but their gratitude was tinged with a deep, superstitious fear. They no longer told stories of the sea, for they felt the sea was now listening. Daisy rarely left the manor grounds. She was the quiet, beating heart of the phenomenon. Her will intertwined with the ancient consciousness of the guest. She spent her days in the conservatory, her hands buried in the soil of strange potted plants that had no name in any earthly botany text. They bloomed with flowers that were not flowers, but intricate structures of living crystal that chimed softly in the windless air. She was not just tending a garden. She was growing an arsenal, cultivating defenses born of a biology that was not of this world. One evening, as a particularly thick fog blotted out the stars, she felt a shift. It was not a sound, but a rupture in the fabric of silence, a tear in the camouflage. A scout, a sliver of the hunter's awareness, had pierced the ward. It was not in the town or the woods or the sea. It was in the mind of the new schoolteacher, a young, imaginative woman named Eliza, who had a habit of staring at the night sky and dreaming of vast, empty spaces. Daisy closed her eyes, her consciousness flowing through the root system of the estate, through the mycelial network that connected the trees, through the very water in the soil, until she found the thread of the invader, a cold, dissonant note in the town's quiet harmony. It was a subtle thing, a seed of cosmic despair, whispering to Eliza that she was alone, that the universe was cold and indifferent, that her life was a meaningless flicker. Daisy did not fight it. She did not confront it. She simply offered a counter-truth. As Eliza sat by her window, a profound sense of peace washed over her, a feeling of being profoundly, utterly held. She looked out at the impenetrable fog and did not see obscurity, but a protective blanket. She felt, for the first time, that she was a vital part of a vast living organism, a creature of immense and watchful grace. The despair evaporated, replaced by a serene, unshakable belonging. The scout, finding no purchase, withered and vanished. The next morning, Eliza arrived at the schoolhouse with a new light in her eyes. She taught the children a song she claimed to have heard in a dream. A simple melody with words in a language no one could identify. A lullaby from the deep. The children learned it instantly, and soon was being sung in every home. its strange, calming notes weaving themselves into the very air of the town. Cedric, hundreds of miles away, woke from a dream of a crystalline song. He sat up in bed, the cold shell clutched in his hand. He knew, with a certainty that chilled his blood, that the first skirmish was over. The war for the soul of the town was being waged, not with swords and fire, but with whispers and dreams. Daisy was winning, and he understood, finally, that her victory would mean the end of the world he knew, not in a cataclysm of fire, but in a quiet, gentle, and absolute assimilation. The witness was no longer needed, for the story was becoming the only reality there was. He put the shell down on the nightstand, its constant cold a small, accusing presence. The dream melody echoed in his mind, both beautiful and horrifying in its perfection. It was a siren song of safety, and its price was the surrender of everything messy, unpredictable, and human. He thought of Eliza, the school teacher, now a willing vessel for a lullaby from the abyss. He thought of the children, their voices raised in a hymn to their own gentle captivity. He could not stay here, in this city of oblivious noise. To be the witness was not to flee and tell the tale later. It was to stand and see, no matter the cost. He resigned his position the next day, giving no reason. He packed a single bag, his movements deliberate and calm. He was not returning to save her or to stop her. He was returning to see. It was the only purpose he had left. The journey back felt like traveling backwards in time, or perhaps forwards into a memory. The landscape grew quieter, the colors more muted. When he finally reached the outskirts of the town, the change was palpable. The air was preternaturally still. The trees in the surrounding woods stood in perfect symmetrical rows, as if they had been deliberately planted that way, though he knew they had grown wild for centuries. There were no fallen branches, no scatter of leaves. Everything was in its place. He took a room at the inn. The innkeeper, a man named Harold who had once been garrulous and fond of gossip, merely nodded, his eyes serene and distant. He did not ask Cedric where he had been. It was as if Cedric had never left, as if his return was a preordained event in a story that had already been written. The next morning, Cedric walked to the cliff path. The fog was thin that day, a high, pearlescent haze that softened the sun. He half expected to find the path overgrown or blocked, but it was clearer than ever, the stones smooth and evenly spaced. It felt less like a path and more like a processional route. He found her in the cove, standing where the gentle waves kissed the dark sand. She was not alone. Arrayed behind her, in a silent semicircle, were a dozen townsfolk. He recognized the baker, the fisherman Old Man Hemlock, and Eliza, the schoolteacher. They stood perfectly still, their faces peaceful, their eyes reflecting the same faint, bioluminescent shimmer he had seen in the basin. They were not prisoners. They were acolytes. The merger was spreading. Daisy turned. She wore a simple dress of a gray, shifting fabric that seemed woven from the fog itself. Her black eyes held no surprise at his return. "You came back," she said. Her voice was a chorus, layered with the whisper of the sea and the hum of the crystalline plants. "I'm the witness," Cedric replied, his voice sounding small and brittle in the vast, organized silence of the cove. "The final alignment approaches," she said, gesturing to the placid sea. "The hunter is near. It has sensed the consolidation. It knows its prey has become something more. It will test the walls soon." "And them?" Cedric asked, nodding toward the motionless townsfolk. "The foundation," she said. "Their faith, their unity, strengthens the ward. They are the cells of a new body, a larger body. They feel no fear. They are content." He saw then the true horror. It was not a violent conquest. It was a willing, blissful surrender. The predator from the stars would find no chaos here to exploit, no fear to amplify. It would find a perfect, harmonious system a world already claimed and digested by a different kind of divinity. "I cannot be a part of this, Daisy," he said, though the words felt meaningless. "You already are," she said, and for the first time, she took a step toward him. She reached out and touched his chest, just over his heart. Her fingers were cold, but a warmth spread from them, a deep, seductive peace that promised an end to all loneliness, all doubt, all pain. It's the most terrifying thing he had ever felt. He stumbled back, breaking the contact. The warmth receded, leaving a void of cold, sharp reality. She did not look offended. She simply looked complete. "The story needs its witness, Cedric. But even witnesses must choose where they stand. You can stand outside in the cold, or you can step inside the story and become a part of its truth." She turned back to the sea, and the acolytes turned with her, a single, coordinated entity. Cedric stood alone on the sand, the only chaotic, discordant note in the entire scene. He was the witness, yes, but he was also the last vulnerable human heart, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his very presence was now the greatest threat to her perfect, silent world. He walked back to the inn, each step a conscious rebellion against the order of the path. The peace he had felt at her touch had been a lie, a beautiful, suffocating blanket. He wanted his anxiety back, his grief, his messy, human fear. They were proof that he was still himself. In his room, he took out a blank journal and a pen. He would not write the history of the Blackwoods, but he would write his own. He began to record everything, not as a scholar, but as a man. He wrote of the way she used to smile before the salt had taken her, of the sound of real rain on the roof, of the vibrant, flawed, and beautiful chaos of the town as it had been. He wrote down the dissonant thoughts, the doubts, the anger. He was building a fortress of memory, a citadel of everything her new world sought to erase. Days passed. The town grew quieter. Fewer people were seen on the streets, and those who were moved with a serene, unhurried purpose that was alien to human nature. The fog was a permanent fixture, a soft gray lid on the world. He tried to speak to Harold the innkeeper about the weather, about anything. But the man just smiled a placid, empty smile and said, "All is well. All is in balance." Cedric knew he was being tolerated, a splinter the body had not yet pushed out. His presence was a flaw in the crystal, and it would have to be addressed. He waited, his journal filling, his resolve hardening. The summons came not from Daisy, but from the town itself. He felt it as a pull, a subtle rerouting of his own intentions. He had meant to walk to the eastern woods, but his feet carried him to the town square instead. The entire population was gathered there, standing in neat, silent rows. They faced the old stone well, and standing on its rim was Daisy. She was radiant and terrible, her form seeming to flicker at the edges, as if she were not entirely solid. "The time is now," she said, and her voice was not loud, but it was inescapable, heard not just with the ear but in the marrow. "A great wave approaches, a wave of nothingness. It will break upon our shore, and we will stand firm. We are the bulwark. We are the silence that answers the void." As she spoke, Cedric saw it. The high pearlescent fog began to darken at the edges, turning a bruised, sickly purple. The air grew heavy, not with moisture, but with a profound pressure that made his ears pop. The townsfolk did not flinch. They looked up at the darkening sky with expressions of serene acceptance. Daisy's gaze found his in the crowd. The witness must now choose. Stand with us or stand aside. But Cedric knew there was no aside. To stand aside was to be edited out, to become a forgotten footnote. He stepped forward, his heart hammering a ragged human rhythm against his ribs. "I am here," he said, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence. I see you." He was not speaking to Daisy, not to the townsfolk. He was speaking to the thing in the sky, the hunter. He was presenting himself, a piece of vulnerable, chaotic evidence that this world was not yet fully claimed. A ripple went through the crowd, the first sign of unease. Daisy's form solidified, her eyes narrowing. "Do not," she whispered. And for a moment, it was only her voice, strained and desperate. The purple darkness coalesced into a single point above the square, a hole torn in the fabric of the world. From it poured not a thing, but an absence, a wave of pure, annihilating indifference. It was the antithesis of the guest's cold order. It was chaos so absolute it became a vacuum. The townsfolk raised their hands in unison, and a shield of visible silence erupted from them, a dome of shimmering air that met the descending void. The collision was soundless, but Cedric felt it in his teeth, in his soul. The shield held, but it wavered. The void was relentless, a pressure that sought not to break, but to unexist. Daisy stood at the apex, her arms outstretched, channeling the will of the guest and the faith of the people. She was a conduit of immense power, but Cedric saw the strain. The void was not attacking their strength. It was negating their reason for being. He did the only thing he could think of. He opened his journal and began to read. He did not shout. He simply spoke his memories into the screaming silence. He read about a summer fair, about a spilled barrel of apples, about a child's tantrum and the mother's laughter. He read about the smell of fresh bread and the sting of a cold wind. He read about the woman, Daisy, and the love he had felt for her before the sea had claimed her. He spoke of fragile, fleeting, imperfect things. Each word was a spark against the infinite dark. They were insignificant, tiny, but they were real. They were vulnerabilities, cracks in the perfect armor of the new world. The void shifted its focus, drawn to this pocket of resistance, this celebration of flaw. The pressure on the shield lessened as the hunter focused on him. A tendril of nothingness snaked down, reaching for Cedric. He did not stop reading. He felt the cold of it, the promise of an end to all stories. Then Daisy moved. She was between him and the void in an instant, no longer a conduit, but a weapon. She did not attack the nothingness. She simply was, a fact of existence so potent and defined that the void could not consume it. She turned her back on the hunter and looked at Cedric, and in her eyes, he saw the full, terrifying cost of her power, and within it, a final, fleeting glimmer of the woman who had chosen this fate to save them all. The void recoiled from the paradox she presented. It had come for a silent, orderly world, and it had found a song of messy, defiant love at its center. With a silent, seismic shudder, the purple darkness collapsed in on itself and was gone. The shield dissolved. The townsfolk blinked, stirring as if from a deep sleep, their serene unity fractured. The fog began to lift, revealing the ordinary afternoon sky. Daisy stood before Cedric, her form fading, becoming translucent. The effort had cost her. She was unraveling, the human and the divine, unable to hold together. "You were always the flaw in the design," she said, her voice a faint echo. "The one variable I could not resolve." "Thank you," he whispered. She smiled, a real, human, sad smile. Then she was gone, not in a flash of light, but like a mist dispersed by the sun. The town slowly returned to itself, dazed and confused, the memory of the event already blurring into a strange dream. The balance was broken. The story was no longer perfect. Cedric stood alone in the square, the journal clutched in his hand. He was the witness, and he had just rewritten the ending. He looked towards the sea, now just the sea, and knew the vigil was over. A different kind of silence remained, one filled with the uncertain, beautiful noise of people being free. Story 4. The clock on the mantelpiece had stopped at 3 minutes past 3. It was not a mechanical failure, not a matter of a dead battery or a slipped gear. Ellen had checked. The slender brass hands were simply, profoundly still. They had been that way for 3 days, and in that time, the night outside the old house on the cliff seemed to have congealed around it. The dawn, a perpetual bruised suggestion on the eastern horizon, a promise forever withheld. The world was holding its breath. She had come to Blackwater House after her grandmother's funeral, the last of the Morwen line. The lawyers spoke of inheritance, of deeds and trusts, but they said nothing of the silence that now filled the halls like a physical substance, thick and heavy as water. The house was a Victorian skeleton of sea-bleached wood and gables that pierced the low sky, a place that had always felt more like a memory than a building. Ellen remembered it from childhood summers, a place of strange shadows and whispered stories, of her grandmother's cool, knowing hands and the scent of dried herbs and salt. On the 4th day of the stalled clock, she found the first book. It was tucked behind a loose brick in the kitchen hearth, a ledger bound in what felt like unnervingly soft, tanned leather. The pages were filled with a tight, looping script, a genealogy of the Morwen women. Not just names and dates, but annotations. Mara, 1872. Gift of foresight, curse of blindness. Eleanor, 1921. Gift of healing hands, curse of a wasting heart. The entries went back centuries. A chronicle of power and price. Her own mother's name was there, Lillian, 1968. Gift of persuasion, curse of silence. Lillian had died young, her voice lost to a sudden, inexplicable paralysis of the vocal cords. She had never spoken of this. That night, Ellen dreamed of a figure standing in the corner of her bedroom, a shape woven from the darkness itself. It had no face, only a profound sense of attention, a sentient stillness that watched her. She felt no fear, only a cold, deep curiosity, as if she were the one who was out of place. When she woke, the smell of ozone and wet earth was sharp in the air, and the clock was still reading 3 minutes past 3. She began to clean, to impose order on the chaos of her grandmother's life, as if scrubbing the floors could scrub away the unease. In the attic, under a dust sheet that billowed like a dying lung, she found a chest filled with artifacts, a lock of hair as white as snow, tied with a black ribbon, a small, polished bone flute, a doll with seashell eyes that seemed to follow her, and a stack of letters tied with twine, the ink faded to a ghostly brown. They were from a man named Alistair Peabody, a scholar from Miskatonic University, dated 60 years prior. He wrote of his ethnographic studies of the local families, his particular interest in the Morwen lineage. His tone was obsequious, then insistent, then finally frantic. The last letter was a single trembling line. You must break the covenant. It is not a guardian. It is a parasite. It is learning from you. Ellen did not understand, not fully, but the words lodged in her mind like a splinter. She took the letters to the local historical society, a small, dusty building on the edge of the dying town. The man who ran it was named Caspian. He was young, with the quiet, patient eyes of someone who preferred the company of the past to that of the present. He knew the name Peabody. He showed her a file, a newspaper clipping from 1959. Alistair Peabody had been found on the beach below Blackwater House, drowned in 3 inches of water. The official cause of death was misadventure. Caspian did not seem to believe that. He started visiting her at the house, under the pretense of helping with her research. He brought her tea and old maps, and his presence was a small warm light in the pervasive gloom. He was her tether to the world of moving clocks and normal dawns. One evening, as a storm gathered over the sea, she showed him the ledger. He traced the entries with a reverent finger, his face pale. They called it the guest, he said softly. That's what the Old Town records say. the Morwen guest, a spirit they bargained with for prosperity when they first settled here. It gave them gifts, but it always took a tithe. It never left. As he spoke, a window pane in the parlor cracked with a sound like a gunshot. A single jagged line splitting the glass from top to bottom. No wind had struck it. The storm was still miles out to sea. Ellen looked from the cracked glass to Caspian's frightened eyes, and she knew. The guest did not like to be discussed. The phenomena escalated. It began with sounds, the faint, rhythmic sound of a rocking chair from an empty room upstairs, the whisper of pages turning in the locked library. Then came the smells, the sudden, overwhelming scent of roses in the dead of winter, a cloying, funereal perfume that would just as quickly shift to the stench of low tide, of things rotting in the mud. Ellen would wake with bruises on her arms, delicate, finger-shaped marks that faded by noon. She found herself knowing things she shouldn't. She could predict the exact moment a seagull would fall from the sky, lifeless, onto the lawn. She could hear the thoughts of the postman, a frantic, buzzing litany of worries about money and his sick wife. The power was intoxicating, a dark nectar. It felt less like a violation and more like a homecoming. Caspian saw the change in her. The way her eyes would sometimes seem to film over, becoming ancient and depthless. The way she now moved through the house, not as an intruder, but as its mistress. Her footsteps in perfect sync with its unseen rhythms. He tried to warn her. Ellen, this thing, it's bound to your bloodline. But the ledger says the gifts get stronger and the curses get worse with each generation. You're the last. There's no one left for it to take from. What will its price be for you? She laughed, a sound that was not entirely her own. It protects us, Caspian. It's part of us. Is it protecting you? He asked, his voice tight with fear. Or is it just preserving its property? He brought her the rest of Peabody's research, notes the scholar had hidden in a safe deposit box. They were the ramblings of a madman, filled with sketches of a formless, shifting mass of darkness and eyes. Peabody's theory was that the guest was a primitive, cosmic entity, a thing of pure potential that had latched onto the Morwen family not out of malice, but out of a kind of alien curiosity. It learned human emotion, human desire, human weakness through them. It fed on their experiences, their triumphs and their sufferings, and in return, it loaned them fragments of its own boundless, terrible power. It was a symbiosis, but one that was slowly consuming the host. The final page was a single, desperate sentence. It is no longer a passenger. It is learning to steer. The revelation came on the night the storm finally broke. The wind screamed against the house, and the sea below the cliffs roared like a living beast. The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into a darkness that felt eager, hungry. Ellen stood in the parlor, the ledger in her hands, and she finally understood the last entry, the one for her grandmother, Moira, 1945. It didn't list a gift or a curse. It simply said, the vessel, the crack in the window pane began to bleed. A thick, black, tarry substance oozed from the fissure, dripping onto the floorboards with a soft, persistent plop dart. The smell of ozone was overpowering. From the shadows in the corner of the room, the same corner from her dream, the darkness began to coalesce. It was not a shape, but a concentration, a density of absence that pulled at the light, at the air, at her very soul. She could feel its attention fully upon her now, not as a watcher, but as a claimant. Caspian rushed into the room, a flashlight in his hand. The beam swept across the oozing window and the gathering darkness, and he cried out, a raw, human sound of terror. Ellen, run! But he did not run. She turned to him, and her face was a mask of serene, terrible knowledge. There's nowhere to run to, Caspian. This is my house. Her voice had changed, It was layered, harmonized with something ancient and cold. The darkness surged forward. It did not move around Caspian. It moved through him. He gasped, his back arching, his eyes rolling back into his head. Ellen watched, dispassionate, as his memories, his love for her, his fears, his simple good life, were siphoned out of him like marrow from a bone. He collapsed to the floor, a husk, breathing but empty, his mind scoured clean. The thing, the guest, turned its full presence to Ellen. It had taken the tithe. Now it offered the final gift. She felt its consciousness brush against hers, not as a separate entity, but as a key fitting into a lock. She saw the history of the world through its timeless eyes, the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars. She saw the countless other families on countless other worlds who hosted similar passengers in the great, dark ocean of the cosmos. And she saw the truth of her own lineage. They were not witches. They were incubators. Each generation strengthened the bond, refined the vessel, until it was ready for the final merging. This was the climax of her family's story. Not a battle, but a consummation. She opened herself to it. The storm outside ceased as suddenly as it had begun. The black substance on the window evaporated. The smell of ozone faded, replaced by the clean, salt-scrubbed air of a new day. On the floor, Caspian stirred, making soft, mewling sounds, a baby rediscovering the world. Ellen, or what had been Ellen, walked to the mantelpiece. She reached out and gently touched the minute hand of the clock. It gave a soft, reluctant click and then began to move, its steady tick-tock filling the silent house once more. She looked out the window. For the first time in days, the sun was rising, its pale gold light washing over the cliffs and the now calm sea. She turned and looked at Caspian, who was staring at his own hands with vacant wonder. There was no malice in her gaze, no triumph. There was only the calm, immense patience of a thing that has finally, after generations of waiting, come home. She smiled, a slow, deliberate expression that did not touch the ancient darkness in her eyes. The heiress had uncovered her heritage, and in doing so, had provided a perfect, permanent home. The line between protection and possession had not just been blurred, it had been erased forever. Down in the town, the church bell began to toll the hour, its sound clear and ordinary across the morning. The night was over. The long dawn had finally broken. And in Blackwater House, the clock continued to tick, measuring out a time that no longer belonged to the world of men. She spent the morning cleaning the parlor. She wiped the last traces of the black residue from the floorboards and window with a rag, which she then burned in the hearth. The air was fresh, the silence different now. It was no longer a waiting silence, but a settled one, deep and complete. Caspian followed her on his hands and knees, not helping, but mimicking her movements with a child's simple curiosity. She guided him gently when he got in the way, her touch making him flinch and then subside into quiet compliance. She made tea, the ritual motions of filling the kettle, and warming the pot feeling both alien and intimately familiar, like a dance learned in a dream. She poured a cup for Caspian and set it before him at the kitchen table. He stared at the rising steam and dipped his fingers into the hot liquid. He did not cry out. She took his hand and dried it with a towel, her movements efficient and devoid of impatience. He needed to be taught everything again. It was a responsibility, but not a burden. It was simply what was. In the afternoon, she led him to the attic. The chest was still open, its contents waiting. She picked up the bone flute and put it to her lips. No sound came out that a human ear could register, but she felt the vibration travel through her jaw, a low, resonant hum that was a call and a command. From the shadows in the eaves, small, skittering things emerged, pale, multi-legged creatures that were not quite insects and not quite spiders. They gathered at her feet, quivering. She looked at them with her new old eyes and understood they were part of the house ecosystem, minor spirits that fed on dust and dreams. She dismissed them with a thought, and they vanished back into the cracks. Caspian watched, his mouth slightly agape. A string of drool hung from his chin. She wiped it away. She found she no longer needed the ledger. The knowledge was inside her, a living library. She could feel the memories of all the Morwen women, their joys and sorrows, their gifts and their curses, all now just data points in a grand, ongoing experiment. She saw her grandmother, Moira, not as a kindly old woman, but as a steadfast warden holding the line, containing the guest until the vessel was ripe. She had been the anchor. Ellen was the ship. As dusk began to gather, not with the previous sense of dread, but with a natural, graceful dimming, she felt a new impulse. It was not hunger, not exactly. It was a need for input, for sensation. She stood at the window, looking down at the town lights beginning to twinkle in the harbor. She could feel the lives down there, 1,000 little fires burning. Their fears were a sharp, tangy spice. Their hidden desires were a complex, heady wine. She could reach out and taste any one of them. The power was immense, coiled within her, waiting to be exercised. But the impulse was followed immediately by a cooler, more calculating thought. A predator that hunts too openly does not last. The Covenant, as Peabody had called it, was about secrecy as much as it was about symbiosis. The family's prosperity had always been subtle, their influence a quiet current under the surface of the town. To reveal the true nature of their power now would be inefficient. It would attract the wrong kind of attention. The guest had learned the value of patience, so she pulled the sensation back, reining it in. She would feed, but slowly, carefully, drawing on the ambient energy of the place over time. There was no rush. She had an eternity of dawns to look forward to. She turned from the window. Caspian was sitting on the floor, trying to fit 2 different wooden blocks together. She knelt beside him. "It's time for you to go home now," she said, her voice still layered with that otherworldly resonance, but softened at the edges. He looked at her, a flicker of confusion in his empty eyes. "Home? Yes, you have a house in the town. You will go there. You will sleep. Tomorrow, you will go to the Historical Society. You will do your work. You will tell anyone who asks that I am well, and that I am sorting through my grandmother's estate. You will remember nothing else of what happened here." She placed a hand on his forehead. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of programming. She imprinted the instructions deep into his blank psyche, building a simple, believable narrative over the void where his memories had been. He stood up, his movements becoming more purposeful. He walked to the door, put on his coat, and left without a backward glance. She watched him walk down the cliff path until he was swallowed by the twilight. Alone, she returned to the parlor. The fire was low. She sat in her grandmother's old rocking chair and began to rock, the rhythm steady and ceaseless. The clock on the mantel ticked on, a perfect, metronomic sound keeping time with the gentle creak of the chair. The house was quiet. The house was full. She closed her eyes, not to sleep, but to look inward, at the vast, dark, wonderful expanse of what she had become. The last Morwen was gone. Something new resided in Blackwater House, and it was just beginning its long, quiet watch. The silence was a garment she wore, a cloak of perfect stillness that was never truly silent. Within it, she could hear the house breathing, the slow settling of its bones, the whisper of the sea against the cliffs a mile below. It was all part of her now. She no longer wondered where she ended and the house began. The distinction was meaningless, a relic of her former, limited self. Days bled into one another, marked only by the sun's arc across the sky and the steady, reliable tick of the mantel clock. She found she had little need for food, and sleep was a forgotten habit. Instead, she would enter states of deep, timeless reverie, sifting through the memories of the guest. They were not linear, not human. She saw the formation of the granite cliffs, the slow crawl of glaciers, the first Morwen settlers building their crude cottage on this very spot, their ambition and desperation, the bright, tasty beacon in the primordial dark. The guest had been weak then, little more than a wisp of sentient hunger. They had fed it with their hopes, and it had grown strong on their lineage. A week after Caspian's departure, there was a knock at the door. The sound was a sharp foreign intrusion. She rose from her chair and went to the window, moving with a fluid grace that was not entirely her own. It was the postman, a man named Dave, his mind a predictable swirl of anxiety about his mortgage and a simmering resentment toward his boss. He had a registered letter that required a signature. She considered not answering. She could simply will him to leave, to forget he had ever come. But a new instinct, a predatory curiosity, stirred within her. She wanted to test the boundaries of her new existence, to see how it interacted with the untouched world. She opened the door. Dave flinched, taking an involuntary step back. "Miss Morwen, you look well." And she did. The lingering fatigue from her old life was gone. Her skin was pale and smooth. Her eyes too dark, too deep. She smiled, and it was a practiced human expression that felt like putting on a mask. "Thank you, Dave. How is your wife? Her back is still troubling her, I see." Dave's jaw went slack. He had never mentioned his wife's chronic pain to her. How did you? She took the electronic device from his trembling hand and signed the screen with a flourish. The name she wrote was Ellen Morwen, but the flowing script felt like a lie. As her finger touched the screen, she let a tiny, focused tendril of her awareness brush against his mind. It was like dipping a finger into a stream. She felt the cold shock of his fear, the dull ache of his financial worries. She could have taken more, could have siphoned that fear away and left him placid and empty, but she withdrew. A taste was enough, for now. "Tell her to try comfrey root," she said, handing the device back. "Steep it in hot water and apply it as a poultice." It was an old, useless remedy from one of her grandmother's memory fragments, but the act of offering it felt appropriately human. Dave mumbled his thanks and almost ran back to his van. She watched him go, a faint, pleasant warmth spreading through her. It had been so easy. The power to unsettle, to know, to influence. It was all there, waiting. The hunger stirred again, a deep, resonant ache. It was not a stomach hunger, but a hunger of the spirit. A need to consume experience, to integrate the chaos of human emotion into her own perfect, ordered silence. She closed the door and looked at the registered letter. It was from a solicitor in Boston, concerning the final probate of her grandmother's will. The words were dry, legal, and utterly insignificant. She dropped it onto a stack of unopened mail. The affairs of Ellen Morwen, the human woman, no longer concerned her. That night, she felt a new pull, a summons from the town below. It was a faint, psychic cry of distress, sharp and sweet. She went to the window and gazed down at the glittering lights. It was coming from the hospital. A life was flickering out, its light guttering in the dark. The fear and pain surrounding it were a potent, intoxicating aroma. Before, she would have felt pity. Now she felt only a collector's appreciation. This was a ripe fruit, ready to be plucked. She did not leave the house. She simply closed her eyes and reached out. Her consciousness slipped through the night, across the cliffs and the town, into the sterile, brightly lit room. An old man was dying, his mind a tangled skein of regrets, and fragmented memories. His family stood around him, their grief a thick, heavy cloud. She did not take his life. That would have been a crude, wasteful act. Instead, she settled at the edges of his fading awareness and drank deeply of the emotional storm. She tasted the salt of his children's tears, the sharp tang of his own terror, the bittersweet flavor of a lifetime of memories unraveling all at once. It was a complex, rich feast. As his last breath left his body, she absorbed the final, brilliant flash of his life's energy. Not his soul, but the unique, vibrant signature of his experiences. She pulled back, sated and humming with a new, vibrant energy. The silence in Blackwater House felt richer, deeper. She had taken the tithe, and in return, the town would continue its peaceful, ignorant sleep. It was the old covenant, perfected. She walked to the ledger, still open on the desk. She picked up a pen, not to write, but to feel its weight. Then, in a hand that was both hers and not hers, she added a single new line below her grandmother's entry. Ellen, 2023. The integration, the legacy fulfilled. She put the pen down. There was nothing more to write. The story of the Morrowind women was over. Her story, the story of the house and its permanent resident, was just beginning. Outside, the moon was high and cold, bathing the world in a silver light that she now knew was just another form of darkness. And inside, the clock ticked on, measuring a time that was hers alone. The following evening, a fog rolled in, a thick, gray blanket that muffled the sound of the waves and isolated the house on the cliff even further. It was not a natural fog. She could feel the moisture in the air responding to her presence, a passive, pleasing extension of her will. The world was becoming more pliable. She thought of Caspian, and a moment later, she saw him. It was not a memory, but a live image projected onto the surface of her mind. He was in his small, tidy house, sitting at a table and attempting to read a newspaper. His brow was furrowed in concentration, his lips moving silently as he sounded out the words. The simple act was a monumental struggle. A part of her, a fading ghost of the woman she had been, felt a pang of something like regret, but it was quickly subsumed by a wave of cool analysis. He was functional. He was stable. He was a perfect, self-sustaining cover. The experiment was a success. The image shifted. She saw the postman, Dave, at a local pub, leaning over a table and speaking in a low, earnest voice to his friends. And she knew. She just knew about Martha's back. Never said a word to her in my life. Gave me the chills, I tell you. His friends were skeptical, laughing it off. But a seed of unease had been planted. It was a small, fragile thing, a tiny crack in the wall of normalcy. She observed it with detached interest. She could let it grow, or she could reach out and smooth it over. For now, she chose to let it be. Observing the ripple was its own form of nourishment. A new sensation pulled her attention away from the town. It was a vibration, deep and resonant, coming from within the house itself. She followed it to the root cellar, a place she had always avoided, with its smell of damp earth and decay. In the far corner, the ground was soft. She knelt, not with human reluctance, but with the curiosity of a gardener tending a plot. She pushed her fingers into the cool, dark soil. They met resistance, something smooth and hard and deeply buried. She did not dig. She commanded the earth to yield its secret. The soil parted like water, flowing away from a long, slender object. It was a bone, yellowed with age, but not human. It was a rib from a creature larger than any that had walked these cliffs in recorded history. As her fingers closed around it, a flood of images assaulted her. A vast, cold ocean. a sky with 2 moons, and a creature of magnificent scale and sorrow, its song a vibration that could shatter mountains. The guest had not always been here. It had traveled. This bone was a relic of its first home, a seed it had brought with it, planted in the soil of this new world to anchor itself. This was a memory even the guest had buried deep, a nostalgic pain it had chosen to forget. She cradled the bone, feeling its ancient, alien resonance harmonize with her own. It was a key to a deeper layer of power, a connection to a far more primal darkness than the one that inhabited this house. The legacy was not just of the Morwen line, but of the guest's own lost history. She rose, holding the bone. The house seemed to still around her, waiting. The tick of the clock in the parlor was the only sound. She understood now that her purpose was not merely to watch over this town, or to feed. It was to rebuild, to gather the scattered pieces of the guest's past, and in doing so, transcend this single, isolated point in space and time. The integration was not the end. It was the beginning of a new genesis. She looked out through the small, grimy cellar window at the impenetrable fog, and for the first time she felt not like a resident of Blackwater House, but like its architect. The bone felt warm in her hand, a dormant energy humming just beneath its polished surface. It was a compass needle pointing to a direction she had not known existed. The house, for all its power, was a cage built by generations of Morwen women. This bone was a map to a world beyond its walls. She carried it up from the cellar and placed it on the mantel beside the clock. The 2 objects, the measured time and the timeless relic, existed in a quiet tension. The house adjusted to its presence, the very air growing heavier, more charged. She could feel the guest within her shifting, a great beast stirring from a long slumber, intrigued by this piece of its forgotten self. Days turned into a single, elongated moment. She stopped bothering with the pretense of tea or cleaning. Her existence was one of pure contemplation and slow, deliberate expansion. She learned to cast her awareness further, past the town, skimming over the sleeping countryside. She found other points of resonance, other places where the fabric of the world was thin. An old stone circle on a desolate moor thrummed with a faint, similar energy. A deep, still lake in a northern forest held a cold, patient presence in its depths. They were echoes of the guest, or perhaps of things like it. They were all alone. The knock, when it came again, was more insistent than the postman's. It was the hard, official rap of authority. She saw him through the door before she opened it. Sheriff Miller, his mind a solid, practical block of duty and a low-grade concern for the Morwen girl, living out here all alone. The seed of unease Dave had planted had taken root and found its way to him. She opened the door and said nothing, simply looked at him. He was a large man, but he seemed to shrink under her gaze. "Ellen," he said, his voice too loud for the fog-shrouded quiet. "Just checking in. Folks are talking. Dave said you seemed different." "People change, Sheriff," she replied, her voice a low murmur that seemed to absorb the sound of his. He tried to peer past her into the house. "Everything all right in there? You getting enough to eat? You look pale." "I'm perfectly well." She allowed a sliver of her will to press against his mind, not to take, but to guide. She pushed the thought that everything was normal, that she was grieving but fine, that this was a waste of his valuable time. He blinked, his certainty faltering. "Well, all right then. You know where to find me if you need anything." He touched the brim of his hat and retreated to his cruiser, his movements slightly dazed. She closed the door, a faint smile touching her lips. The sheriff's simple, sturdy mind had been easy to manipulate, but the encounter was a warning. The human world was a web of connections and concerns. Its threads kept pulling at her, threatening to ensnare her in its trivial dramas. She needed a more permanent solution, a way to ensure her solitude. That night, she went to the cliff's edge. The fog was hers, and she parted it with a thought, staring down at the black water churning against the rocks. She raised the bone in her hand and began to hum, a sound that was not a melody but a frequency. It was the song of the creature whose rib she held, a call of loss and longing that had crossed the void between stars. The sea responded. The water began to churn not with the wind, but with a purpose of its own. From the depths, a thick, greenish mist began to rise. It was different from her fog. It was alive, a colloidal suspension of microscopic life that glowed with a faint bioluminescence. It rolled over the harbor, clinging to the docks and the houses, seeping under doors and through window cracks. In the town, people would wake tomorrow feeling weary, their thoughts slow and thick. They would forget their worries, their ambitions, their curiosity. The mist would not harm them. It would simply encourage them to stay indoors, to keep to themselves, to accept the world as it was without question. It was a blanket of peaceful apathy, a gentle cage of her own making. She lowered the bone. The work was done. The town would sleep a little deeper now, and Blackwater House would be left in peace. She turned her back on the harbor lights, now blurred and softened by the new eternal mist. Her work was not in the world of men. It was here, in the quiet house on the cliff, with a clock that ticked off ons and a bone that held the secret to worlds beyond this one. The watch had truly begun. The bone on the mantel began to sing. It was a low, constant thrum that vibrated in the marrow of the house, a note so deep it was felt rather than heard. The clock's ticking adapted, its metronomic click settling into the rhythm of this new, ancient heartbeat. She stood between them, the conduit, the focal point. The integration was not a static event, but an ongoing process, a symphony she was learning to conduct. Weeks filtered through the fog, which now never truly lifted from the town below. It was a permanent, gentle shroud, a boundary between her domain and the world of haste and hunger. She received no more visitors. The mail ceased. The world had effectively been walled off, and she was free to turn her attention entirely inward and downward. The cellar was no longer a place of decay, but a place of genesis. The spot where she had found the rib was now a shallow, carefully tended basin. She did not plant seeds. She placed objects into the dark soil. A piece of sea glass worn smooth by centuries of tides. A lock of her own hair, from when she was still merely Ellen. A single rusted nail from the original Morwen cottage. And always the centerpiece, the bone itself, half buried as if resting. She would kneel for hours, her hands pressed flat against the earth, feeding it memories and intention. She was not growing a plant, but a concept, a new anchor. The soil, charged with the essence of the guest and her own transformed will, began to change. It became darker, richer, and faintly warm to the touch. Tiny phosphorescent fungi sprouted in a circle around the basin, their pale light pulsing in time with the bone's hum. One afternoon, as a storm lashed the cliffs outside, she felt a sudden, sharp pull from the basin. She went down to the cellar and saw it. A shoot had emerged from the earth, not green, but a stark, impossible white. It was slender and hard, more like polished stone or ceramic than any organic matter. As she watched, it grew, not with the slow patience of a tree, but with the unnerving speed of a time-lapse film. It branched, twisted, and formed a lattice that climbed toward the low ceiling, its structure echoing the intricate, non-Euclidean geometry of the creature from the bone's memory. This was the beginning. This was her first true act of creation, not consumption. The house groaned, its timbers shifting to accommodate this new internal spine. The lattice was a receiver, an antenna. It was pulling something from beyond the fog, beyond the sky, tuning into the same frequency as the bone. She could feel the signal strengthening, a faint, alien thought stream beginning to trickle into the silence of Blackwater House. It was not the guest. It was something else, something that had heard its song. She laid a hand upon the white lattice. It was cool and vibrated with a potent energy. The storm outside meant nothing. The sleeping town below meant less. She was no longer just a guardian or a collector. She was a gardener, tending a new and terrible crop, and the harvest would be one of stars.